right. Well, good morning, everyone. And welcome to the second WSGA rules review session. Just a few comments before we start. Just a reminder that each week when Bill and David send out the email for that week's session, whether you're going to join us online or attend, please let them know. Because if you're going to attend in person, we need to make sure that we don't have 30 people trying to cram into this room. And as we've said, Bill needs to have an idea as to how many donuts to buy on the way in. And if you're joining us online, please let us know, because we have a limit of 1,000 people to join us online. So it would be on a first-come, first-served basis. Fortunately, the ability to watch the recordings later on YouTube will help person number 1001 and beyond still get in his rules fix.
What is the number joining us now?
I think it's, how many people are joining us now? I think it's 612.
Should be 20.
We should have 28. I think last week we had about 25 or 30. So. Good. All right, well, last week we covered definitions in rules 1 through 3. So today we will pick up where we left off with Rule 4. Rules 4 and 5 work well together, both dealing with the essential equipment items that a player must have in order to play the game, specifically clubs and the ball. And, as we've done before, what we'll do is we'll go through the rules, not necessarily teaching rules, but covering the, significant points and some kind of subtle but important points, and go through the decisions that are especially helpful. All right, so Rule 4-1, form and make of clubs. 4.1a, the players' clubs must conform with this rule and the provisions in Appendix 2. So the key point with this is that it doesn't say the clubs the player uses must conform to the rules, as we'll see, that, for example, in Rule 5-1, that only the ball the player uses must conform. But here, the clubs the player carries must conform, even if he never uses the club. So if he carries but does not use a non-conforming club, he will be penalized, and we'll see in a minute what that penalty would be. 4-1b, wear and alteration. A club that conforms when new is deemed to conform after wear through normal use. And one point to be aware with this rule, as well as with, and we'll see under Rule 4-3, is just that there is a difference between wear and damage. The two situations are treated very differently. That with wear, or perhaps the best example is of grooves, that especially with, say, sand wedges, where you have lots of practice hitting out of the sand, and the grooves over time might become wider than Appendix 2 allows. But that is permitted. That's considered to be wear. And you contrast that with, say, damage, where let's say a player is hitting a ball from near a tree, and the shaft of the club bends when he hits it from near that tree. Under Rule 4-3, we'll see that he can use that club for the rest of the round, but he is not allowed to use that or carry that club even in his next round with that in that state with the bent shaft. Because when the shaft is bent, it's considered not to conform. And so the key there is that club shot from against the tree with the bent shaft, that constitutes damage. Damage is more of a one-time occurrence, and wear is just usually an erosion over time. That the USGA's test center, I think, had a good way to look at it. That wear is, say, what happens to your tires over time, just the gradual erosion of material, whereas damage is what happens if a rock flies off a truck and comes through the window. One-time thing, and we'll see wear and damage are treated differently. So just be aware that there is a difference. All right, Rule 4-2, playing characteristics. With 4-2a, first point is that the prohibition against purposely changing the playing characteristics occurs only during the stipulated round. So outside that stipulated round, you are allowed to change the playing characteristics. A common example is the application of lead tape. That's okay to do before you tee off, but not okay to do during the round. The second point is that this provision applies against intentional changing of playing characteristics. So Rule 4-3 will cover, damage and an unintentional changing of playing characteristics, and the two are treated differently. And the third point is that this is Rule 4-2A applies to the act of intentionally changing playing characteristics during the round, regardless of whether the player actually makes a stroke with that club. So the simple act of changing the playing characteristics is by itself a breach. And as we'll see, that there is a different penalty, or there are different penalties on whether you change the playing characteristics but don't use the club, or you change the playing characteristics and you do use the club. But the key point for now is that the simple act of changing the playing characteristics is by itself a breach. Rule 4-2B, similar foreign material must not be applied to the club face for the purpose of influencing the movement of the ball. So as soon as you apply that foreign material for that purpose, that is a breach of the rule. And now we'll look at kind of an interesting penalty statement that applies both to Rules 4-1 and 4-2. And it's broken into two parts. The first, the much longer section, deals with the penalty if a player carries a club that's in breach of one of those two rules but does not actually use it to make a stroke. And the second part, the very short part, applies to the situation where a player actually makes a stroke with a club that's in breach of this rule. And so probably the two most common breaches of this rule are a club that doesn't conform. For example, the grip doesn't conform, the grooves are not right, the shaft is bent, something like that. Or as well with a player who has purposely changed the playing characteristics of his club during the round. Say, third hole, he put a piece of lead tape on the back of his sand wedge. All right. So penalty statement, match play. At the conclusion of the hole which the breach is discovered, the state of the match is adjusted by deducting one hole for each hole which a breach occurred, maximum deduction of 2 holes. All right, and this is the part that's a little, that's not necessarily intuitive, but in a match, let's say Bill and I are playing the third hole, and I'm getting ready to hit, I'm getting ready to hit my approach shot, and I pull out my 6-iron. I say, "Whoa, the shaft is bent." And Bill correctly says, that doesn't conform to the rules. You started around with a non-conforming club if you used it. And I say, "No, this is my first shot with that club." Then what would we do? Well, as strange as it seems, we actually finish that hole. So we finish the third hole, and then we apply the penalty. In that case, what would my penalty wind up being? So let's say I win the third hole, so that before the application of any penalty, I am 1 up on Bill. And then we realize, whoops, John started with a non-conforming club, he didn't use it, so I would wind up having the maximum of 2 holes deducted, so I would go from 1 up after 3 to 1 down. So I'm 2 holes worse off. So the key there is that we don't apply that penalty until we finish the third hole, which is a little strange because we know that at that moment we don't know the exact status of the match, but we will until we have to finish the hole. We know that penalty is looming.
John, what if you were 2 down after the third
Okay.
hole?
All right, that's a good question. What if, say, Bill, let's make it more realistic. Let's say Bill had won 1, he'd won 2, and he goes on and wins 3. So I'm 3 down. Can I be penalized further? And the answer is yes, that I could actually, I would wind up being 5 down after that. And that's a very good question, and it relates to why this penalty structure is the way it is. And we'll see it in several other rules today, under Rule 4-4 and under Rule 6-4, for example, where in match play the penalty is a deduction of holes rather than a loss of hole. And the reason for that is that the rules makers want to make sure that the player is penalized for this breach. That, in other words, that if I had lost the first 2 holes anyway, and the penalty has been loss of hole, then in effect I'm not penalized. And there are certain situations under the rules where it works out that way, but this is a case where that the rules makers just want to make sure that the guilty player is penalized and doesn't effectively escape penalty by also coincidentally of having had a bad hole or hole.
So you're saying that after 1 hole you could be 3 down?
Well, after 1 hole I could be 2 down. This is the 1 hole.
That's right. Yeah, right. You only have 1.
And then that's kind of a trivia question that, especially when you get into Appendix 1 and the various conditions of competition, where say, okay, if all local rules and all conditions of competition are in effect, what is the fewest number of holes that could be needed to win a match? So let's say, for example, I start with too many clubs. I have a non-conforming club. I have too many caddies. I ride when I'm not allowed to ride. If I do everything wrong, and I forget what the answer. I think you could wind up having something like a 6-hole match, but somebody could do the math and figure that out.
If the penalty or the breach is discovered between the play of 2 holes.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that, because that's one where it is different with these what we call kind of status of the match penalties. There are 2 different treatments as to what happens when the breach is discovered between holes. So let's take 2 cases where it matters where the breach was discovered, because it affects the maximum penalty. So let's say Tim and I are playing a match, and walking from the first green to the second tee. So we finished number 1. I realize that Tim looks in my bag and realizes I have a club that doesn't conform for some reason, but I had not used that club on the first hole. So the question is, am I going to be penalized 1 or 2 holes? And what this penalty statement goes on to say under match play or stroke play, if the breach is discovered between holes, it's deemed to have been discovered during play of the next hole, and the penalty must be applied accordingly. So in that situation with Tim, what would he and I do? First, that we would actually finish. We're not finished. We'd start and then finish the second hole, and then I would wind up with a maximum 2-hole deduction. So that's an example where it applies to the next hole. Now we'll see under Rule 4-4, the 14 club rule, that's a different treatment. Let's say Tim and I are playing in between 1 and 2. Tim looks in my bag and counts 15 clubs. Then under the 14 club rule, 4-4A, that breach is not considered to apply to the second hole. So it would apply only to the first hole. So I would have only 1 hole deducted under Rule 4-4A. And there's not necessarily an easy way to remember in which circumstances the breach applies to the next hole and which circumstances it applies only to the previous hole. I'm afraid it's one of those things I think you just have to learn, or at least, there are a lot of things in the rules where you don't necessarily have to know everything, but you just have to know that you need to look it up, and that there is a difference.
So what's the logical rationale for that?
Okay. Well, in some cases it's different. Like, for example, with Rule 6-4, the 2 caddies, if you realize or someone tells you you're in breach of the caddy rule by having more than 1 caddy between 2 holes, it makes sense for the penalty to apply to the next hole. But what if there's a 1,000-yard walk between holes? Then you could actually have some benefit from having that extra caddy go towards that next hole. But in this case, what makes it tricky and really necessary is the fact that 4-1 and 4-2 are lumped together, and the penalty statement applies to both those rules. So, for example, in Rule 4-2, it makes sense that if going from hole 1 to 2, I apply lead tape to my club. It's intuitive and sensible that is a breach of the second. You've already finished the first hole, and just difficult to think how that could apply to the first hole. But on the other hand, if you can make a case that application is not appropriate if player started with a non-conforming club. So if going from 1 to 2, Tim notices I have a non-conforming club, why not treat that the same way as a 14th club? Because there really isn't any benefit being gained from my having that non-conforming club on the way from 1 to 2. But because of how we have to treat 4-2, same as 4-1, it's that way. And when you look at the length of the penalty statement, the notion of adding a half-page penalty statement under 4-1 with a slightly different result to cover a pretty rare situation probably isn't.
The extremely rare event that I would start the round with a non-conforming club in between play of the first and second holes, I would put lead tape on it. So now I have a breach of 4-1 and 2. Because the penalty statement is the same, would I be limited to a single penalty?
Right, so you start with a non-conforming club, and then you apply lead tape to the
that club.
Well, let's see. Well, we know that if you make a stroke with that club, either way, you're going to be disqualified. So, are you going to be penalized once or twice? Because there are two different acts involved: the act of just carrying the non-conforming club, then the different act of applying the lead tape to it. Then there are two different rules, 4-1 and 4-2. So I guess my initial thought would be maybe would get multiple penalties in that case. So, all right.
Well, you're a baddie.
All right, so let's go on to the stroke play penalty. That's a little more straightforward. Stroke play, 2 strokes for each hole which a breach occurred, maximum penalty per round of 4 strokes. And just clarifying that it's 2 strokes at the first 2 holes which a breach occurred. So, for example, if on the 4th fairway, Ken applies lead tape to his club, but he doesn't use it on 4, he doesn't use it on 5, and then on 6, someone questions what he did. Let's say on 10, someone questions what he did, but he still hasn't used that club. He would incur the maximum penalty 4 strokes in those two. In stroke play, since the hole-by-hole scores have to be correct, it's important that we know where those penalty strokes would be applied. In this case, it'd be applied on the 3rd hole where he first did this, then the 4th hole, the next hole, which he still carried but did not use this club. All right, and then the asterisks section is important. Any club or clubs carried in breach of 4-1 or 4-2 must be declared out of play immediately upon discovery that a breach has occurred. If the player fails to do so, he is disqualified. So as soon as the player realizes he's in breach of this rule, for example, he realizes that he is carrying a non-conforming club, he must declare that club out of play.
John, if it happens after the round is over, and before he reports his score, that'd be different than after the score is reported? In terms of declaring it out of play, or decide what?
Got a non-conforming club.
Well, it could depend. What would affect things is what the penalty would be. So let's say, for example, we're sitting in the scoring tent, and you look in my bag and you say, well, that pitching wedge doesn't look right. You pull it out, and sure enough, for some reason, it's not right. It doesn't conform. And then I go through my round, and it turns out I didn't hit any shots with it. So in that case, I would still add the 4 penalty strokes before I return my scorecard, with 2 strokes at the first hole, 2 strokes at the second hole. But then let's say I return my scorecard, and on the way to the parking lot, you look in my bag and notice that there's something wrong, that the pitching wedge doesn't conform. Well, in that case, now I'm going to wind up being disqualified, not directly because the pitching wedge didn't conform, but because I had a scorecard error, because I didn't include those penalty strokes on my scorecard. So my scores for the holes 1 and 2 were lower than I actually made.
John?
Yeah.
Was the term declared out of play, and this came up last week, I forget what the circumstance was, with the club. Declaring a club out of play, you can
still carry the club, or do you have to do the Ian Woosnam thing and throw it in the bushes?
Yeah, that's right. So some of you might remember the 2001 British Open on the second tee. He had 15 clubs, including 2 drivers. As you can imagine, he wasn't very pleased, so he tossed one of the drivers into the bushes. Do you have to do that? And the answer is no. And that's why this provision is the way it is. It says you just have to declare it out of play. So you can still carry it. Some people go to the length of turning it upside down. You don't necessarily have to do that, but if you want to do that to help remind yourself not to use that club during the round, then that's fine. But it is specific in terms of saying to whom you have to declare it out of play, to your opponent, match play, or marker, or fellow competitor in stroke play, but you can still carry it. All right, the second part of the penalty statement deals with a player who has actually made a stroke with a club in breach of this rule. So, for example, he's carried a non-conforming club and he goes ahead and makes a stroke with a non-conforming club, or he has intentionally adjusted the playing characteristics of a club and gone ahead and made the stroke with that. In that case, it's very straightforward. The player is disqualified. All right, so now on to Rule 4-3, the damage clubs. Remember that there is a distinction between damage and wear. And this rule is broken up into 3 sections based on how the damage occurred and when the damage occurred. First is damage that occurs during the round in the normal course of play. And we have a decision, 4-3/1, that talks about what is meant by the normal course of play. And it's a fairly broad decision, as the first paragraph of the answer says. The term normal course of play is intended to cover all reasonable acts, but specifically includes cases of abuse. So if a player is doing something reasonable, even just leaning on his club, and if the club breaks, that is considered to have occurred during the normal course of play. And we'll see that that's important, is if the club is damaged in the normal course of play, the player is allowed to do a number of things that he may not do if it occurs outside the normal course of play. So first, the player may use the club in the damaged state for the remainder of that round. So this is the case even if the club no longer conforms. For example, if the shaft is bent, and even if the playing characteristics have been changed. For example, the lie or loft was changed when the player hit his ball off a cart path or something like that. And he's still allowed to use that club for the rest of the round because of how that damage occurred. He may also have that club repaired. So he could try to repair it himself if that's possible, or he could have somebody perhaps run into the golf shop and see if the golf professional could repair it for him. That's okay. And we have a decision that talks about what repair means, and that is that repair means restoring the club as nearly as possible to its original condition before the damage. Then the third option the player has is available only if the club is damaged so much that it is also unfit for play. And we'll see in a note what unfit for play means, that the player is allowed to replace that club with any club. So if a player breaks a 6-iron while hitting it from against a tree, he could put say a sand wedge in his bag. That would be all right to do. The restrictions are that the replacement of the club must not unduly delay play, so he can't sit in the fairway for 10 minutes waiting for someone to bring him another club, and it must not be made by borrowing a club selected for play by someone else playing on the course. So in that case, for example, if Bill and I are playing together and I break my 6-iron in the normal course of play, I can't give Bill $20 for him to let me have the 6-iron out of his bag. But if he was to say, oh, John, I happen to have a full set in my locker in the trunk of my car, here are the keys if somebody wants to go get that, then that's okay, because the 6-iron in the trunk of his car is not one that he had selected for play for that round, so I could get that. And also, and this was an addition for 2012, the player is not allowed to add that club by assembling components carried by or for him during the round. And so for example, if he is a truly paranoid player and carries a number of heads and shafts in his bag, just in case something bad happened, he can't just snap them together during the round and use that. That certainly, if let's say for example that his driver breaks during the round, during the normal course of play, then he sends his caddy or spectator or official to the golf shop to get him a new driver. It's certainly fine if in the golf shop they say, well, let's see, okay, he wants a stiff shaft, 10.5 degrees loft, and get the shaft and head and snap them together, then that would be okay. But the player may not carry those components.
A question that came up in our state amateur one year, a player caved in the face of his driver, and it was a tailor-made, could be disassembled quite quickly, separating the shaft from the head. Could the pro shop bring out a new head so that the player could continue using the shaft of the club? And his statement was that he spent $400 on a shaft.
If that's possible, that'd be okay, because he's in a position where he's allowed to replace that club. So that would be fine.
And even though he's assembling the club, it's not being carried forward.
Exactly. Because the key in that case is that the club head came from the golf shop, and that it's not something.
Well, that was down in Kenosha we had that, right?
Correct. Right. So the penalty for breach of this rule is the same, and for brevity, because it's a fairly lengthy penalty statement, they just refers to the penalty statement under 4-4A, or the 14 club rule.
We have a quick question.
Okay.
That if a player trips and falls on his bag and breaks a shaft, would that be considered a normal course of play?
All right. If a player falls on his bag and in doing so breaks the shaft of a club, would that be considered a normal course of play? I think in that case we would. That was, you hate to say that clumsiness is reasonable, but it is. That's different. If we look at decision 4-3/1 with the 3 examples at the bottom of the acts that are not in a normal course of play, you can tell, these are really cases of abuse and more intentional acts, such as throwing a club, whether in anger or even throwing a club up in a tree to try and knock a ball down, slamming a club into a bag, or intentionally striking something with that club. I think that's different than just accidentally tripping. And the same thinking would apply sometimes, let's say, especially at the first tee, where if you're playing in carts, everybody tees off, hop in the cart and go, and whoops, your bag wasn't strapped on the back. Your bag falls off, and if something is damaged, I think you could say that was a normal course of play too. But that's different from these cases of abuse, many of which are intentional in the decision. So good question. All right, Rule 4-3B, damage other than in the normal course of play. So let's say, for example, if a player in anger just bangs his club on a cart path, and in doing so that changes the lie of the club, then he has changed the playing characteristics of the club. He didn't intentionally change the playing characteristics, so therefore he's not in breach of Rule 4-2A, but he did change the playing characteristics during the round, not in the normal course of play. So let's see what the ruling is. If a player's club is damaged other than normal course of play and it renders it non-conforming, for example, the shaft is bent, or it changes the playing characteristics, as in my example of changing the lie of the iron, the club must not subsequently be used or replaced during that round. So what that means, if I bang my wedge on the cart path, now as a result the wedge has a more upright lie, there's no penalty for that simple act, but I must not use that for the rest of the round. And where this can come up the most is with putters. So if a player misses a putt and bangs his putter, hopefully not on the green, but maybe against his foot, and so doing, let's say he changes the loft of the putter or the lie or the shaft is bent, and then he goes ahead and, say, taps in the remaining 6-inch putt, what would the ruling be? He would be disqualified. He would be disqualified. So hopefully the player will catch himself, or a rules official will catch him after he does this, but before he makes a stroke. And that's why occasionally you'll see a player on TV putting with his 3-iron or his sand wedge or what have you, because that probably means that he did something with his putter that changed the playing characteristics and was not in this play.
There's a fine line about changing the characteristics of the club, though, that could come into play there. I mean, change the characteristics 2 degrees or 3 degrees or something like that. You can't really tell.
Well, you're right. And that if I take my wedge and really slam it on the path, how can we say for sure whether those playing characteristics have been changed? And as we've said, and we'll say again many other times during these sessions, that in many cases the hardest part of being an official is just determining the facts. So once you know the facts, the ruling is pretty straightforward. But in this case, the fact of it was the playing characteristic changes my 56-degree wedge. Now I have 55 degrees of loft on it. That's really hard to eyeball.
One of the more famous breaches of that rule was Woody Austin slamming his putter over it.
Oh, remember there was the case with Ben Crenshaw in the 1987 Ryder Cup at Muirfield Village, where he banged his perhaps the best putter ever, banged his putter on the ground, and I forget what he did. It could be the head even came off, something like that, but he putted the rest of the round with, I think, his 1-iron back then. And I'm sure he still did pretty well with it. So the lesson there is if you have a temper, you might occasionally practice putting with other clubs. All right, Rule 4-3C, damage prior to the round. This is a rule that doesn't come up much, in part because there are just very, very few situations when it could apply. A player may use a club that is damaged prior to the round, provided the club in its damaged state conforms with the rules, and that damage that occurred prior to the round may be repaired during the round as long as the playing characteristics are not changed and play is not delayed. So a lot has to happen for this rule to apply. One, club has to be damaged, but in the damaged state, the club has to conform to the rules. And then 3, in order to repair it, that repair cannot change the playing characteristics of the club. So best example of that is it's a stretch to think of examples for this rule is with the old whipping around persimmon-headed woods. If that's loose, if that becomes loose prior to the round, it's okay to start your round with that club, and to repair it, say tape it back up during the round, because that club still conformed and you're not changing the playing characteristics. Rule 4-4A, which has more use or sees more action than some parts of this rule. Player must not start a stipulated round with more than 14 clubs. So that is the moment of truth for this rule, when the player actually starts the round. What clubs does he have in his possession? He's limited to the clubs thus selected for that round, but if he starts with fewer than 14, he may add any number provided he doesn't exceed 14. So if he does that, the addition must not unduly delay play, and the player must not add or borrow a club selected for play by anyone playing on the course or by assembling components carried by or for him during the round. And this is a good example where, for example, a player may not start his round with 1 club and have 20 shafts and 20 club heads and say, okay, what club do I need for my second shot? Assemble that. Okay, now I've got 2 clubs, and then go on, because that's really just a way to circumvent this 14 club rule. But it's effectively, the mathematicians can tell us, okay, if you've got 20 club heads and 20 shafts, how many different possible clubs you could put together from that. So would really be a way to circumvent this 14 club limit. So that's why the part about components is included there. Yeah.
What if I got the clubs in my bag and I go out to the first tee and I forgot to take, I had 2 6-irons in there that I was trying. I forgot to take one of them out and put it in the trunk of my car, and I got 15 clubs in my bag, and I don't start my round, but I just say, oh, I forgot that the 6-iron was in there. It's too late for me to take it back in the car. Can I declare that out of play and just start?
Well, you see, what's interesting, and that touches on what a candidate for the least popular decision in the decisions book, decision 4-4C/1, where a player does just that. He does what everyone wants players to do. He counts his clubs before he tees off, realizes he has too many. He says, oh, okay, I'll take this extra 6-iron. I declare it out of play. I'll put it on the floor of my cart, and then he tees off. So is he in breach of the rule? The answer is yes, because bottom line is he started the round with more than 14 clubs. And the part, and we'll get to it in the penalty statement about declaring a club out of play, that applies only after the player is already in breach of the rule. There's nothing within the rules that allows the player to declare clubs out of play before the round. So that seems kind of strange in a lot of people. And it's a very touchy issue for some people that, they like to dream up an extreme example. Okay, well, if it's a shotgun start and you're out on the 6th tee, and it's at the edge of the property, and it's a rough neighborhood, you don't want to leave a extra club there, lying there, because it'll be gone. And if that's the case, then maybe you should just count your clubs before you go out to the 6th tee. Count them in the parking lot. And what can you do? You can hide it in the bushes. You can, if it's a shotgun start, maybe you can just leave it right in the middle of the tee with a note asking someone in the next group to stick in the bag and bring it to you afterwards, something like that. But
there you go. There it is. All you need is
that's it. That's all I need.
I think you don't even need
so there's a 4-4B. Partners may share clubs, provided that between 12 of them they don't have more than 14. So if Bill and I are partners in 4-ball play, and I have 8 clubs and Bill has 6 clubs for some reason, then we can share clubs. So the key there is that neither one of us has access to more than 14 clubs during the round. And in practice, it's not as if people carry 8 and 6 clubs and share. How that really happens is, say, if someone the airline lost his bag, and so I just play out of Bill's bag or something like that. All right, the penalty statement will be similar to what we saw, just 4-1 and 4-2, but not identical. So in match play, the conclusion of the hole at which the breach is discovered, the state of the match is adjusted by deducting 1 hole, maximum reduction of 2 holes. So Ken and I are playing a match on the 6th hole, and notices I have 15 clubs. I must have started around 15 clubs, and we finish the hole we're playing, and then we deduct 2 holes from my perspective. So if after the 6th hole, if I would have been 1 up, I'm now 1 down. Now stroke play, 2 strokes for each hole. There's a breach, maximum penalty per round of 4 strokes. So if I start in the 6th fairway, I realize I have 15 clubs. Those penalty strokes I would get 2 penalty strokes at the first hole, 2 penalty strokes at the second. But it's important not to fall into the trap of just assuming that in all cases those penalty strokes will apply to holes 1 and 2. Because let's say, for example, on the putting poorly, and at the turn, I add another putter that gives me 15 clubs, and then I play several holes with that putter. And then on the says, wait a minute, John, that's not the putter you started the round with. That's what gives. In that case, where would the penalty strokes apply? 2, 10, 11. 2 penalty strokes to 10, 2 penalty strokes to 11, because those were the first 2 holes at which a breach occurred. Then, as we saw with 4-1 and 4-2, before we get there, what to do with the penalty if the breach is discovered between holes, and this is where it's different than 4-1 and 4-2. Because in this case, it's deemed to have been discovered during play of the previous hole. So if going from hole 1 to hole 2, Arnold looks in my bag and says, John, you've got 15 clubs, I'm only going to be penalized at the first hole, not going to be penalized at the second hole.
But if you're playing Arnold, he's very smart, so he'll wait till after the second.
In regard to your question where I play 9 holes,
get the max out.
And after 9 I grab a new putter, and now I'm in breach, and I'm playing you in a match, or even if it's stroke play, and several holes later, you say, you have a 15th club. Can I declare any club out of play, or must it be the club that I add?
All right, that's perfect, because it leads us to the next section. So let's read the rule and then go over Bill's good question. 4-4C. Any club or clubs carried or used in breach of this rule must be declared out of play immediately upon discovery that a breach has occurred, and the player must not use that club or clubs for the remainder of the stipulated round. So let's go through 2 examples. Let's say on the 6th hole, I realize I started the round with 15 clubs. Now, at that moment, can I point to just one of those 15 clubs saying that's the specific club that put me in breach of this rule? And the answer is you really can't, that any of those 15 put me over the limit, so I could declare any of those 15 clubs to be out of play. So that's the case where I just start with too many clubs. But now to the example where I added a putter at the turn. In that case, can I point to a specific club that put me in breach of this rule? The answer is yes, that it was that new putter. So with Bill's question, then I would have to declare that new putter that I added at the turn, I would have to declare that one out of play.
Doesn't matter whether it's 15 clubs or 21 clubs. Penalty's the same.
That's right. Penalty's the same. Penalty years and years ago used to be incremental. So if you start with 17 clubs, you get a greater penalty than you start with 15 and so forth. But if you somehow start with 17 clubs, it's the same as starting with 15 clubs.
Do you have any kind of knowledge of the history of where the number of clubs allowed you to be?
Well, I believe the limit was introduced in 1938. Because before that time, I think especially Lawson Little was in the habit of carrying 20-some clubs. And what's interesting is when you go to golf museums and you look at various clubs, the reason behind the rule starts to make a lot of sense because they had clubs designed for a lot of specific purposes, for hitting the ball out of water, for hitting the ball off a road, and so forth. And at that time, they came up with 14 because they felt that was a quote-unquote normal set at that time, and obviously we've stayed with it. So in the penalty for breach of 4-4C, so that means for either not declaring the club out of play or for making a stroke with it after you declare it out of play is disqualification. All right, so with all that in mind, let's look at a few decisions here. And many of the ones under this rule are pretty straightforward. 4-3/1 meaning of normal course of play, we touched on earlier. 4-3/2 meaning of repair, we talked about. And then one point that was a revision for, I believe it was 2012, that's worth noting, it to some degree touches on a question I think Bill asked earlier, is that final paragraph of 4-3/2 that helps us with the distinction between repair and replace. It reads, when a club is damaged to the extent that the grip, shaft, or club head has to be changed, this change exceeds what's meant by repair. Such action constitutes replacement and is only permitted if the club was unfit for play. So with Bill's case, if the player wants to keep his $400 shaft and replace the club head, that would be treated the same as replacing it with an entirely new club and not just repair. So, and it's possible to come for that to be meaningful, but in many cases, it'll be treated the same. Where often, for example, in Bill's case, where the club head caved in, that damage was such that he could have repaired it or replaced it. So the replacement was just fine. Let's see. Anyway, decision 4-4A/1 is can be a useful one because it tells us the trigger point for when a breach of this rule occurs. Let's go back to my example where I took 22 putts on the front nine, and I started with 14 clubs, and I want to get a new putter. And there's a delay at the 10th tee, so while my group's waiting to tee off, I go to my car, get another putter out of the trunk, and I come back, and Bill says, John, what are you doing with that? I said, I'm going to see if my luck changes on the back nine. He says, no, you can't do that. You start with 14 clubs, you're limited to that. I say, oh, okay. Then I go return that putter to the trunk. Have I breached the rules? And the answer to that is no, because I did not make a stroke with any club while I had that new putter in my possession. So that can save a player in situations like that. Decision 4-4A/9, clarification of match play penalty, is a useful one just to walk through the examples and to get comfortable with the whole adjustment of the state of the match penalty in match play. Because it is the type of penalty that we're not necessarily used to. It's a different penalty, and it can lead to some results that, as we talked about, don't at first might not seem quite right, such as being 4 down after 2 holes or something like that. I think it's helpful. It can be helpful to go through those examples just to become comfortable with that different type of penalty, especially as that penalty does come up in several rules. Decision 4-4A/10 talks about where to apply the penalty. We went over the examples. In many cases, it will be to the first 2 holes of the round, but not necessarily in every example. Decision 4-4A/15 talks about assembling components during the round. And again, this is, we won't go through this in detail, but it's a type of thing that's it's good to know that there is a decision on components so that if that does come up, you know where to go. And then we talked about decision 4-4C/1, perhaps the least popular decision in the book with that. So that is Rule 4. Any questions on that? Yeah, John.
John, in the case of the thing during the course of play, screw comes loose, the whole place. Then that necessitating repair.
Okay, all right. All right, good question. With the drivers that have adjustable weights and so forth, let's say one of those weights, one of the screws becomes loose during the round, is that something that a player may tighten under the pretenses of repairing the club? The answer to that's yes, that would be considered damage during the normal course of round, and that by tightening it to the way it was before the round, not adjusting it any other way, that would be considered a repair and therefore permitted.
But there's no way of knowing whether the characteristics change loose.
Well, my limited experience and my understanding with those clubs is that there's really just kind of one position you can tighten it to, and if it's either there, that that's in that position. But if you have to take the player's word and say, yes, you can restore it to the pre-round setting. That's the right term, but you can't change it to any other setting. So you can tighten it because having it loose would be considered damage. It's not unfit for play, but it would be considered damage.
We have a question.
In regards to 4-4C/1, okay, the question talks about, is the player subject to a penalty if he takes a 15th club out of his bag and puts it on a golf cart, okay? And then the answer is he's penalized. But then the last sentence says there's nothing in the rules to permit carrying around an excess club declared out of play before the round. So he's declared that club out of play, puts it on his golf cart, he's penalized, he keeps it in his bag, he's not.
Oh, no. What this is saying is that either way, and I wouldn't put too much emphasis on where the club physically is. So whether, if, for example, he gets to the first tee and says, oh, geez, I've got 2 putters in my bag, that gives me 15. I'm this ping putter out of play. And whether he keeps it in his bag or he puts it on the floor of his cart, either way, the ruling's the same. Either way, it's going to be a penalty because the bottom line is he started the round with 15 clubs. So what that last sentence just means is that there's nothing that allows him to avoid penalty by doing what he did.
We have an online question, actually 2 of them now. One is, does Rule 4-4, specifically the second paragraph regarding performance, prevent a player from carrying an extra club head? And I think I know the answer.
An extra club what? Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's a good question. What is a player? I have to try to take as realistic a situation as possible. Before the round, you've got a player who's a real tinkerer with his equipment, and while he's on the practice tee, he's trying several different club heads with his driver, and then he settles on one. It settles on the 9.5 degrees or whatever. Then he puts the 10.5 degree club head in his bag. Is simply carrying that extra club head a breach of the rules? And the answer to that is no, because a club head by itself is not a club. So that does not count towards a 14 club limit. And the key, though, is that he's not allowed to use that other club head during the round.
That's kind of a fine line between, I mean, it's so easy to make these adjustments. To put that on.
Could he use that club head if someone brought him a shaft, correct? Because of that carry.
Yeah, so even if the other club becomes damaged in the normal course of play, becomes unsafe to play, he can't use that extra club in his bag. Okay, and was there one other question? Did you say?
It was more of a comment.
Oh, positive or negative? Yeah, and about who? All right, on to...
It was neither positive nor negative.
Okay. All right, Rule 5, the ball. This rule is much more straightforward than Rule 4. 5-1, the ball the player plays must conform to the requirements specified in Appendix 3. So that is a difference with Rule 4. That, in other words, there's no penalty if for some reason you carry a non-conforming ball in your bag. That if you have some sort of non-conforming ball, maybe it's too small, but you like to putt with it on the practice green before the round as some sort of practice aid. Carrying but not using that non-conforming ball is fine. It's not a breach of the rules. Only if you actually take a stroke with a non-conforming ball will you be penalized. And you see the note, the committee may require players to use a ball named on the current list of conforming balls. And the reason for that is that if you show a golf ball to the starter and say, does this ball conform to the rules? Well, odds are the starter's not going to be able to conduct all the necessary tests then and there to determine that. So by being able to look at the conforming ball list, that allows him know that the WSGA has conducted all these tests and has determined the ball. Foreign material. Again, this is different than how we treat foreign material as applied to a club face. in that the ball the player plays must not have foreign material applied to it for the purpose of changing the playing characteristics. So, in other words, if a player for some reason applies foreign material to a ball but never uses it, there is no penalty. And now 5-3, which is the part of this rule that comes up the most with rulings. Although, safe to say it doesn't come up as much as it used to, just with the quality of golf balls these days they're being made and how consistent the quality is and how durable they are. So the rule starts with an vetted definition. The ball is unfit for play if it's visibly cut, cracked, or out of shape. It's not unfit for play just because mud or something else adheres to it, the surface is scratched or scraped, or the paint is damaged or discolored. So a pretty tight definition of what unfit for play means for a golf ball. So if a player has reason to believe the ball has become unfit for play during play of that hole, so if in the 8th fairway you think, geez, I think I cut this ball back on number 7, well, you may not substitute balls during play of number 8. This applies only when the damage occurred during that hole. If the player thinks that may have happened, he may lift the ball to determine whether it's unfit, but there is a specific procedure he needs to follow to do so. Before lifting the ball, he must announce his intention to do so. He must mark the position of the ball, and then he may lift and examine it, and he needs to give his opponent or in stroke play his marker or fellow competitor the opportunity to examine the ball as well as to observe the lifting and the replacement. And more often than not, the opponent or fellow competitor will just say, fine, go ahead, and will not actually watch you lift and replace the ball or examine the ball. And this is one of the few cases that we'll see where a player may not clean a ball that has been lifted. But on the other hand, if the players lift the ball from the putting green, let's say, for example, I thin my sand shot, but it winds up on the putting green, and I think I may have cut the ball. So without saying a word to anyone, I go over, mark the position of my ball, and lift it. Is there any breach of the rules there? In that case, no, because why? Because the penalty is I'm on the putting green. Rule 16-1B allows me to lift the ball on the putting green for any reason. However, I do need to give the marker or fellow competitor the opportunity to examine the ball to see if it's unfit for play.
John, is this one of these situations where it's off the green now, where you pick the ball up and you have to put it back down exactly the way it was?
Oh, okay. All right. All right, good question. Let's say my ball's in the fairway and has a clump of mud on it, but I think I may have cut the ball because it struck the path or something. And I lift the ball. I tell Bill, my fellow competitor, lift the ball, mark the position. I lift it, and we look at it. I don't clean the mud, wipe the mud off, and we determine that no, I just scraped it. I didn't cut the cover, so it's not unfit for play. So I have to put the same ball back down. When I replace it, do I have to replace it in such a way that the mud is in the same position, orientation? Answer to that is no, I do not. In part because it's almost physically impossible to do that, and in part because that's just asking too much for the player. But as long as the ball gets back on the same spot, the orientation of the mud can't change.
Supposing the player plays a shot which obviously doesn't hit any surface other than ground, it doesn't hit a tree or any other object, and now the player decides that he would like to lift it to see if it's unfit for play, for the sole purpose, obviously, of being able to replace it so that the mud would not interfere with the blade hitting the ball. That a breach?
Well, I think what you could say in that case, let's say, for example, a player hits his tee shot down the fairway, and there's absolutely no reason reason for him to think that anything happened, but he has a clump of mud on his ball, and somehow it's clear he wants to lift the ball. Well, in this case, and that's why the provision is written in here, that if a player has reason to believe his ball has become unfit for play during play of the hole, he may lift it. So if he doesn't have reason, such as in that example, he lifts the ball and he's going to have a penalty stroke for lifting the ball. And granted, when he places it, he can reorient the mud, but it's with a penalty stroke. So that helps prevent the players from taking advantage of the play for that reason. That's why the language is so. And that leads well into the next paragraph. If the player fails to comply with all or any part of this procedure, or if he lifts the ball without having reason to believe it became unfit for play during play of that hole, he incurs 1 penalty stroke. So in Ken's case, the player would get 1 penalty stroke, or in the case where, let's say, a player doesn't do anything correctly, he hits his ball into the rough, he thinks it's unfit for play, and he doesn't tell anyone he's going to lift it, he doesn't mark the position of the ball, and he cleans it. Even though he botches everything, he'll still wind up with just 1 penalty stroke.
John, we'll probably be going through this down the road, but okay, situation where you have 2 balls that are really close to each other off the green, and so you're going to mark. In that case, do you have to make sure that you put the ball back down exactly the way you picked it up?
Oh, yeah, even in a Rule 22 case where you're lifting the ball because it interferes with another ball, while you're not allowed to clean it, when it's time to replace that ball closer to the hole, he still does not have to put it back in the same orientation. So there are no situations under the rules where you have to replace a ball in the same orientation in terms of where the mud is and so forth.
You can't place it on the mud.
Yeah.
Then, that's what
but the thinking is that if you actually place it on the mud, then you're not actually returning it to the correct spot. That when you think of a correct spot, it has both a horizontal and a vertical element. So if you tee it up, then you're not getting the vertical element of the location correct. So, all right. Now, if it is determined the ball has become unfit for play during play of that hole, the player is allowed to substitute another ball and will just place it on the spot where the original lay. Otherwise, meaning that ball did not become, it's determined that the ball was not unfit for play, the original ball must be replaced. Now, if a player substitutes a ball when not permitted and plays that wrongly substituted ball, he incurs the general penalty for breach of this rule, but there is no additional penalty under this rule or Rule 15-2. So this is one example we'll go through where, especially those of you who've been to PGA, USGA rules workshops from several years ago, remember we'd often talk about the phrase 1 + 2 = 2. So let's say a player lifts his ball to see if it's unfit for play, but he had not told his fellow competitor what he was going to do until after he had lifted the ball. He lifts it, then they both agree that, yep, that ball's cut. So he's allowed to substitute. He substitutes balls and plays. In match play, you'll simply lose the hole. In stroke play, you'll wind up with a total actually, that's not a good example. Let's say let's change example. He does not follow the procedure, so he does not tell his fellow competitor he's going to lift his ball. He lifts the ball, and it turns out the ball is not unfit for play. It's just scratched. But he goes ahead and substitutes balls. Then he plays that substituted ball. So in match play, you lose the hole. In stroke play, it would be a total penalty of just 2 strokes. So even though he did 2 things wrong, he didn't follow the procedure, and he substituted when not allowed, that this sentence here will limit that penalty just to 2 strokes. So he has not received the additional 1-stroke penalty for failing to.
The penalty is for playing a substituted ball,
Correct.
Not for failure to apply to the rule.
Correct.
John, in that case, then for the next hole, does that substitute the ball become his ball?
Oh yeah, and then that ball, as soon as he substitutes and plays, that is his ball in play and continues on, and he'll be penalized. And certainly no problem with using that ball in the next hole, because among other things, you know, he could have changed balls between holes anyway. So it's okay.
So now, if he lifted the ball without stating his intention, found it not unfit for play, replaced it and played it, then it would be one stroke in both match play and stroke play. Is that correct?
Correct. If he does not follow the procedure, but he either correctly substitutes balls or correctly replaces the original ball, depending on whatever the determination is, then it would be one penalty stroke in both match play and stroke play. All right, final paragraph dealing with an extremely rare case. If a ball actually breaks into pieces as a result of a stroke, then the stroke is canceled and the player must replay it. Penalty for breach of this rule is the general penalty of loss of full match play or 2 strokes in stroke play, and with the asterisk part, just re-emphasizing what we discussed. If the player incurs the general penalty for breach of this rule, there is no additional penalty under this rule. So how could a player incur the general penalty? The most common way would be that if he substitutes balls when the ball is not unfit for play. Another example would be if he lifts the original ball, and whether it's with that ball or a substitute ball, when he's allowed to substitute, if he does not correctly return it to the original spot, if he winds up playing from a wrong place somehow, he would incur the general penalty. Note 1 is worth, no pun intended, noting, because it is a tighter restriction than Rule 2-5 that we covered last week regarding the time limit that an opponent has in match play to make a claim about something the player does. Where generally if Bill and I are playing and I do something that Bill thinks is contrary to the rules, that Bill has until one of us tees off on the next hole to make a claim. But in this case, with the ball, that issue needs to be resolved immediately. So if that opponent or fellow competitor wants to dispute the claim of unfitness, he has to do so before the player plays another ball. So in other words, the player is entitled to have that issue resolved before his next stroke. All right, and the decisions.
With regard to the last paragraph of 5-3, where it says if a ball pieces as a result of a stroke, the stroke is canceled. The player is played. My understanding is that there needs to be 2 different pieces, and that simply being cracked or cut would not allow a player to cancel the stroke.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would read that literally when it says it needs to break into pieces. That means you have 2 separate pieces. They could be different sizes, certainly. And I remember back when I was at the WSGA, someone called in, I forget if they even sent a photograph of a ball that was 95% or 98% in 2, but it wasn't 100% in 2 pieces. Saying, does that satisfy the requirements of broken pieces? And with what Bill said, the answer is no. It needs to be 2 separate pieces. All right, with the decisions, let's see, fairly straightforward. One point, especially for since we all officiate here, is with decision 5-3/7 question that comes up a lot. Let's say a player hits a ball into the rough, into the trees, and you're the rules official in that hole, and you're helping him search for the ball. And he finds it, and then he says, well, gee, it also hit that building or hit the cart path. It might be unfit for play. May I lift to see if it's unfit? And it's okay for you as the referee to fulfill the role of the fellow competitor in that case by letting him tell you, and by you're observing the lifting and replacement. That's okay. The more common applications often with Rule 12-2 with identifying a ball, that a player will often do that. Is more likely to happen than Rule 5-3 with an official. So any questions on Rule 5 here?
I have a question, and I don't know if this has been covered and if I just overlooked it, but We're now about to start, Rule 6, and I have heard could you discuss the term general penalty?
Okay, yeah, general penalty. Well, at the end of Rule 2 and end of Rule 3, each rule has kind of a catch-all rule saying, unless otherwise stated, the general penalty in match play is loss of hold, general penalty in stroke play is 2 strokes. And those two provisions are in there in case a rule, for example, Rule 17-4 does not have a penalty statement to it. In case a player breaches Rule 17-4, something he doesn't do what that rule requires, if he thinks the ball rolls away, then by default, if there's no penalty statement, you go to Rule 3-5 or Rule 2-6, depending on the form. So when I say at the end of the rule the penalty is the general penalty, that's just shorthand for saying loss of hold in match play or 2 strokes in stroke play.
I was wondering if you could kind of explain the difference between Rule 5-1 states the ball the player plays must conform to the requirements of Appendix 3, and then Decision 5-1/3 deals with the case of a player playing an original ball and then subsequently a provisional ball. The provisional ball is played but never becomes the ball in play, so there is no penalty under that decision. And yet that ball was played, and I guess my question more specifically is, why does Rule 5-1 not state that the player's ball in play must conform to the requirement?
Well, and you could have a case, and there are variations you can go through with that. And essentially, what that decision says, and you have somewhat of a similar principle under Rule 7-2 when there's a decision about, say, Bill, if I want to make some practice strokes with your putter between holes. We say that's okay because I'm not doing that for a stroke that actually counts when I winds up counting my score. It's largely the same principle. That what that principle is that the strokes that ultimately count towards your score must be played in accordance with the rules. And that strokes for these rare cases that were canceled, or in this case, the provisional ball that never got the ball in play. And I think the thinking is that, well, since that stroke never contributes to a score, should we really care about that? Right. And I think that's a good example of why we need the decisions book.
That actually, the decision happened in our stadium.
Really?
You were the one on the hole.
With a non-conforming ball? I'm just curious what kind of...
No. We had the one ball rule. And
the one ball.
And a player hit like a Titleist that might have been lost, and then he hit a TaylorMade, and then it came up as the player incurred the penalty. No, because it never became the ball in play.
And that's the type of question. If that were to happen and that decision weren't in the book, we could spend hours going around about that with very valid arguments on either side. So it's a good example of use of the decisions book. All right, Rule 5 was a short rule. Rule 6 is not. All right, so Rule 6. This is the first really large rule we'll come across. It's a big one, but it has a common theme, and that is the rule covers items that are all the player's responsibility. So by saying it's the player's responsibility, that means if he doesn't do what this rule says, he's going to be penalized. And it's interesting to pair this with Rule 33, another long rule, because that rule lays out the committee's responsibilities, and the two rules often go hand in hand. For example, we'll see that in stroke play, the player is responsible for the correctness of his hole-by-hole scores when he returns the scorecard, and that the committee is responsible for the addition of those scores. So it spells out who is responsible for what. Rule 6-1 establishes a big principle. The player and his caddy are responsible for knowing the rules. During the round, for any breach of a rule by his caddy, the player incurs the applicable penalty. So what this means, in effect, is it's golf's version of the legal expression that ignorance of the law is no excuse, that the player is responsible for knowing the rules and to a large degree is deemed to know the rules. Remember, the definition of rules and everything that includes the rules of golf, the items and the appendices, the decisions, local rules, conditions of competition. So the player is responsible for knowing all of that.
And yet, there are so many rules that are interpreted by whether or not the player knew he was breaching a rule.
That's right. There are several rules where the answer does hinge on the player's rules knowledge, and a lot of those rules involve Rule 1, questions involving Rule 1-3, whether players have agreed to waive the rules, where last week we said that you can only agree to waive a rule if you know the rule you're waiving, and also in match play where players might especially do something out of where a player might do something out of ignorance, and if his opponent doesn't make a claim about it, then there's not going to be a penalty.
So that's why I find the language difficult to comprehend.
Well, it is, but on the other hand, it's, I think those specific cases, it makes sense that the application of those rules makes sense. That in other words, while everybody's deemed to know the rules, that if, provide knowledge in some select cases, for example, if two players who don't know if a certain local rule is in effect, even though they should, they're responsible for doing it, agree that a player should proceed in such a way that in stroke play, still that player is responsible, and he's going to be penalized if he proceeds incorrectly. But if in match play they do it, should they really be disqualified for trying to do the right thing when they just didn't know?
There used to be a decision under 6-1 that talked about what is meant by what rules that the player should know, and that's no longer there because it's part of the decision under rule or rules. And just wanted people to know that. With regard to local rules, one of the things in like a WSGA event or a PGA Tour event where the players are there for 2 or 3 days playing practice rounds, there are things posted all over. Many times for state golf associations or junior tour events or club events, a player is handed a local rule sheet, so to say, moments before teeing off. And, you've written them, I've written them. They can be quite lengthy. There's no way a player is going to really be reading all that before teeing off, but yet he's still required to know that under the rules.
Among other things, I think you bring up a very good administrative point that I know I've talked with some other people about. The one thing that I remember from the 2004 PGA Championship at Whistling Straits that I really liked, and I don't think it was just because of the uniqueness of Whistling Straits and all the bunkers and how they put signs everywhere saying all the bunkers are bunkers and so forth. So they did that in 2004, and obviously in 2010 that was a big issue, but again, they did everything they could. But what I liked, what the PGA of America did, is in the players' locker room, every time the PGA during the practice rounds would come up with a new draft of the local rule sheet, they would post that in the players' locker room for players to be aware of that. Whereas, and it may well have changed, but I know the USGA used not to give the local rule sheet to the players until the first tee on Thursday or whatever the first day of that championship is. And as you said, that puts an awful lot on the player. You're on the first tee, first round, national championship or any tournament. You're pretty, your stomach's in knots. Then to say, oh, here, by the way, you better know all this. I don't think it's reasonable for committees to expect players to read it there. So I like the idea of, and it's a luxury when you have players playing practice rounds beforehand to be able to show them local rule sheets, or at least drafts of them well in advance, because, among other things, that could help determine their play. For example, if you know on a certain hole it's been marked yellow, that if there is or is not going to be a dropping zone, that could determine how aggressive you might be with going for the green in 2 or something like that. So some of these things, for example, with grandstands, if you know that there's going to be a dropping zone near the green, if you're in the grandstand light of number 10, that might work into your play, and I think that's okay. So I like the idea of letting players know as far in advance as possible for the very reasons you give. Realizing that often there have to be last-minute tweaks to it and so forth, but I think in general it's a good idea. All right, on to Rule 6-2, handicapping. Broken up into match play and stroke play, but as we'll see, wind up with different results. Before a match in a handicap competition, the players should determine from one another their respective handicaps. And we use the word should, because if they don't, then, well, they have a mess, and they just have themselves to blame for it. But if a player begins a match having declared a handicap higher than that to which he's entitled, and this affects the number of strokes given or received, he is disqualified. So if Arnold played a match, and if I'm a 7, I tell Arnold I'm a 10, then I would be disqualified. Otherwise, meaning if the handicap is lower, or if it is higher but it does not affect the number of strokes given or received, then I play off the declared handicap. So if I am a 7 and I tell Arnold I'm a 4, then, well, I've just shot myself in the foot and I play off a 4 and receive 3 fewer strokes than I should. In both match play and stroke play, it talks about if it's a higher handicap and this affects the number of strokes given or received, the player is disqualified. And how can that be? You can have some forms of play when players are entitled to just a percentage of their handicaps, like 80% or 90%, and there can be certain numbers where if a player declares a handicap 1 stroke higher, that he winds up receiving the same number of strokes if he had stated his correct handicap. That's an example, a very rare example, where a player could declare a higher handicap and wind up not penalized because he winds up receiving the correct number of strokes.
But he has to receive them. In other words, if I claim I'm an 8, and really I'm a 6, but the 7th and 8th strokes are on 17 and 18, and we never get to that far.
That was going to be
okay, all right.
So I haven't received the benefit of my falsehood.
Okay, all right, good question. So so Tim's a 6, but he says he's an 8, and he's playing Gary, and he's and let's say he's playing well, and how would this be?
That's a bad example because the strokes would be on the 2 strokes. One would be on each 9. So let's do a 1 stroke. I lied by 1 stroke, and that particular one is
no, but let's say it's the
17.
Yeah. So let's say you're a 7, but you play to an 8.
Yeah.
The 8th handicap hole is number 16.
Right.
But you close Gary out 4 and 3, so you never actually use that 8th stroke. Or are you still in breach of this? And the answer to that is yes, you are. In part because knowing where those strokes fall, that can determine your play and your opponent's play during the round. Your opponent might say, geez, I know Tim's got this getting the stroke on 16, so I've got to go for it here on 15. That's the thing.
But it doesn't really say that, does it? His entitlement is given or received. Given, yeah. Given is the key word.
I think.
Okay. Very good.
All right, so now stroke play. In any round of a handicap competition, the competitor must ensure that his handicap is recorded on the scorecard before it's returned to the committee. If no handicap is recorded, or if the recorded handicap is higher than that to which he's entitled and he receives more strokes as a result, he is disqualified from the handicap competition. So several things here. One, it doesn't say that the player has to put his handicap on the scorecard, because often these days the golf shop staff will print out scorecards with the handicaps on them using a plug for our Blue Golf vendor at WSGA events. But if that number is not correct for some reason, or if the golf shop staff is handwriting the handicaps on the card and gets it incorrect, it's still the player's responsibility to make sure that the correct one ultimately is on the card that's returned to the committee. And if it's interesting to note that if no handicap is recorded, the player is disqualified. Why not just have the player play off scratch? Well, because if a player's a +2, he winds up getting a good deal by playing off 0. So that's why no handicap is treated the same as a handicap that is too high.
John, given the fact that the course ratings, handicaps can change, I can be a 4 on one course and go to another course, I might even be a 6. So when we're playing in competitions, and Bill, I guess I'd like you to address that, where we have handicaps. How often do you have a situation where somebody reports to you, my handicap is too high, it should be lower? And is there some tolerance involved? If you tell me I'm a 5, but I think I should be a 4, that's 20% more, but am I required to report that?
Well, it's a good question. Let's look at a couple of decisions on handicapping before we leave it. First one to note, and it's an interesting one, that it was the decisions were silent on this matter for many, many years. 6-2/1, what exactly is the handicap that the players were required to give under Rule 6-2? That, for example, in this country, we think about our handicap index and we think about our course handicap. So which is it? And basically what this says is it's what we would call your course handicap. So in a stroke play competition, the competitor must ensure that the handicap for the course he's to play and tees to be used is recorded on his scorecard when it's returned to the committee. So again, what we in this country would refer to as our course handicap is what has to be on there. And then I think, Gary, see if this relates to your question, 6-2B/0.5. So let's say in a 4-ball stroke play competition, players don't receive their full handicap allowances. So what is the player responsible for recording on his scorecard? The answer is he must record his full handicap, so his course handicap, and then it's the committee's responsibility to apply the condition of competition to adjust the handicap. So if players are entitled to only, say, 90% of their course handicap, then it's up to the committee to determine what that 90% would be.
Can I ask a question? What if the committee prints what you would refer to as the condition of competition, or what I call the tournament handicap, on the card? Because we do.
Okay.
Trying to let the player know what he is for that competition.
Well, that's interesting. So let's say if a player's course handicap is 6, but he gets 90%, so that makes him, 5.4, so a 5. And the committee gives him a scorecard that says his handicap is 5. And he returns that with a 5. Has he fulfilled the requirement of this rule? I don't.
Please say yes, because we're going back.
You do that all the time.
Well, Gene, how long? Because it would have gone on in security as well.
You're right. I can understand, but that's obviously a great savings of the software to be able to do that. So I can understand the desirability of it, but that's a really interesting question.
Would we be better off printing both? I do believe that's possible.
I think you're better off printing both, yes. Because if you only print 5, then I wonder if, strictly speaking, you then have to take 90% of 5, which is goofy and obviously not desirable. But I think the strict reading would be, you should see if you can print both, and hopefully you can.
So in other words, 5.4 and
5.
Well, or print 6 as the course handicap, and then 5 as what he's entitled to under the conditions, under the 90% condition. Yeah.
Bill, wouldn't that same issue come up, and the guy says, I've got the wrong scorecard, I'm either in the wrong division, and we just let him play on that scorecard, or from a different set of tees, like in the senior tour events? But we never really adjust the handicap that you do in the computer.
Well, like if a guy's switching divisions with phones and what have you, we can look it up immediately and tell the guy. But I'm telling you, what we tell him is the tournament handicap, because I've always thought that that's what he needs to know. It's interesting. But I'm glad to see that our assistant tournament director is online and said that he will make sure both are on.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. No one's ever asked that before. I imagine that probably happens all the time.
I always bet that goes on throughout the United States, would be my guess.
Well, you always, how would they know, as a player, how would you know, all right, which one is actually mine? You know.
Well, for instance, in like a net partners, we play because it's a net 4 ball, we tell the USGA recommendation of 95% of handicap, course handicap for men, 90% of course handicap for women, and that is the number that's printed on your scorecard. And in listening to you, it should be the 100% of the course handicap, and then show people the adjustment. If the committee printed out a handicap list that had both the 100% and the tournament handicap, that still doesn't satisfy Rule 6-2, does it?
I'd say without the course handicap being on the scorecard, it doesn't
Correct.
satisfy the requirement.
Isn't your tournament handicap, Bill, the same as if I took my index and adjusted it according to the slope of the course? Is that what you do? Isn't that what you do?
Well, yeah, that's what's being determined as the course handicap, and John alluded to that. That 100% number needs to be printed on the scorecard. That number, 100% number, according to the rules. And Jeff wrote this, we do print off a handicap report that shows the 100% and then also the tournament handicap. And like when we print scorecards, one of the things we do is go back and forth making sure that the handicap on the scorecard matches the number and makes sense to us in terms of 95 or 90 or whatever the number is. But it should be the 100% that's on the scorecard. We're going to print both to solve any issue. And he just,
All right, very good question. All right, Rule 6-3, time of starting in groups. 6-3A, the player must start at the time established by the committee. Penalty for breach of this rule is a little bit more, or is more involved than our normal penalties, in that it's a two-step penalty statement, and even then it has a qualifier. That if the player's late, but he arrives at the starting point ready to play, within 5 minutes after his starting time, the penalty for failure to start is loss of first hole in match play or 2 strokes at the first hole in stroke play. Otherwise, meaning after the 5 minutes the player shows up, or he arrives at the starting point within 5 minutes, but he's not ready to play, then he is disqualified. All right, so the starting point would be, say, first tee, 10th tee, what have you. So what does ready to play mean? Well, kind of the bare bones definition of ready to play means you have a ball and a club. Even if it's your putter and a ball, you're able to play, satisfied the requirements, and therefore you could have the lesser penalty rather than disqualification if you show up 2 minutes late. But then we have this exception, and this exception is really there because, as we'll see later on Rule 33-7, a penalty less than disqualification may not be waived by the committee, but we still want to provide for cases where a player might show up at the first tee less than 5 minutes late, but with an all-world reason that warrants no penalty, and that's why it's accepted there. So there's no conflict with Rule 33-7, where the committee determines that exceptional circumstances have prevented a player from starting on time, there is no penalty. And they do mean exceptional. So, for example, just saying the traffic was bad is not exceptional. That something more along the lines of, I know people roll their eyes as, we keep using that example, but if, that you pass a car accident on the way there and you're a doctor and you stop and administer first aid, or you pull a body out of the burning car or what have you, that, okay, we'll committee should cut you some slack for saving someone's life and not penalize you. so the rules do have a heart.
But on the other hand, if you just get caught in traffic at an accident and don't render aid.
Yeah.
Tough bananas.
Yeah, if you're just selfish and you stay in your car looking at the radio, you don't want to be penalized.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
I have kind of an administrative question. At a WSGA championship, let's say that you were playing in the U.S. Mid-Am and on the way you stopped at a car accident to save my life, and then you showed up at the course 2 hours after your tee time. And when it came time, your tee time, obviously there's alternates there. And the WSGA would grab the first alternate and you would tee off in John Morrissette's position. One question I have is, would you wait 5 minutes for the person to show up and then put him in? Would you tee off the other two players, have them go, wait 5 minutes, then have the alternate tee off? And then my ultimate question is, if the alternate teed off, took your spot in the field, you then show up 2 hours later and there is good reason to put you in the field, is the alternate? Okay.
Very, very good question. First point is that it is possible to show up more than 5 minutes late with a great excuse and not have any penalty. And the second point is, is from an administrative perspective, as you can imagine, there's the potential for all sorts of serious headaches with that. And the first more basic question of at what point do you put the first alternate? Do you put him in right at the starting time? Do you put him in 5 minutes after the starting time? And there's not really a right or wrong. I've heard committees that do different things. Some will have the alternate go in, some will have the alternate wait for 5 minutes. It seems to me that most committees wait for the 5 minutes because in many cases a player does wind up showing up within the 5 minutes. But even then, I think it's a good idea at 5 minutes when the alternate does tee off to go ahead and tell him the potential. And I've heard some starters tell us, say, look, okay, you're in, but if Bill Lindemann shows up with an all-world excuse, he's going to get in and we're going to pull you from the course. Which, granted, for the alternate, it's not a great mindset. So you tee off and say, well, okay, maybe I'm in the tournament, maybe I'm not.
And then later on, he could have been in because somebody else didn't show up.
Somewhat attached to that, how would the WSGA deal with that in terms of where to put that player?
Well, I think with where to put the player, is let's say to take worst case scenario, where let's say he was due to tee off in the last group at 2:12 or whatever, and he shows up at 5 o'clock.
This is so far-fetched.
Yeah. Fortunately, it is far-fetched. Then I think what the committee should do is send him out at 5 o'clock with a marker and try to do the best you can. He'll probably have to come back the next morning and finish his round with a marker. But what's interesting with that is, let's say this happens early in the day, and the marker goes out there, and he's along, and he's on the 7th hole, he's 200 par, he's happy, and he says, oh, geez, bad luck, Ken, Bill just showed up. Well, how should the committee deal with that? A good way, I think the right way to do it, again, to be safe, is to I would have Ken finish the hole he's playing. So, say, finish hole number 7, and say, sorry, Bill's in, you're out. because let's say an hour later someone doesn't show up, then this is where it gets complicated. And, it makes it, then, you can go back out and you work out whenever you do it. It could be when this other group has reached the 8th hole or something like that, and have him join them so he already has a score for those first 7 holes.
This isn't related to that, to the time of starting, but this did happen at the high school tournament. There was a year when the 4th hole at University Ridge, the tee shot, sometimes can't see him come at you. There was a kid, his tee shot was waiting for the green to clear to play his approach. And he was in the left rough, and the group behind him teed off, and someone shouted 4. The kid turned around to look at the tee, and a ball literally right between the eyes and knocked him unconscious. Not only that, there was blood everywhere and what have you. The kid wanted to continue when he finally woke up. And he was still bleeding, so without telling you what happened, I was wondering if you could comment, is the guy SOL?
Well, I'm glad you didn't go into the details, because I would have probably passed that too. In fact, is the 4th, is that Gary's hole that he's always talking about?
No, that's Gary's. It happened at a different hole.
Okay. No, but there's a decision under this rule that says ordinarily allow a player 10 to 15 minutes to recuperate from hit by a ball, bee sting, heart attack, whatever. Minor. and after that, it's they say it's not a good idea for the reasons you logistical, administrative headaches. So I would say I would go by that. And I would say, hate to say it, but if player can't reasonably resume play within 15 minutes or so, I'd say, and it sounds like he should have played anyway, but even if he's dying to play, I think it's probably, I'd probably not let him. The committee has some leeway, that 10 to 15 minutes, but I think in general, it makes sense.
John, there's a situation that occurred in the WSGA Senior Championship at Milwaukee Country Club. On the tee was Mr. Jack Tuthill, and he was preparing to tee off, and one of his fellow playing partners was swinging the club and banged him right in the head, knocked him down. Meantime, there was one alternate, Mr. Hal Cook, who was waiting around to hoping that somebody would show.
Oh, wow.
And hearing Tuthill out cold on the first tee. So Hal gets his clubs and runs over there and starts warming up, figuring he's going to go. And Tom Meeks is running the situation. So now Hal says, "Can I go? I mean, what's the situation?" And Tom looks on and he says, "Well, we got to at least give the guy 5 minutes to recover." And Tom's looking at the watch here, I'm telling you, 5 minutes. And about 4 minutes like that, Jack struggles up. I mean, he doesn't know where the hell he's at, but he's, wandering around like that. And Tom says, "Are you capable of playing?" And where am I at? He says, "We're at Milwaukee Country Club playing." He said, "Gee, it doesn't sound like you're ready to play." And all of a sudden, I'm ready to play. And Hal says, walks up there and says, "Are you sure you're ready to play like that?" So there was an altercation between and Meeks finally says, "Well, if you can hit it, you play. You can't, alternate." So he tees the ball and wobbles around, strikes on about 240 down the middle, right, and it goes on and goes to the quarterfinals, and Hal never won.
Okay, that's a heck of a story. I can't believe I ever heard that, because that's a great story, one for entertainment, first and foremost, entertainment purposes, but also from a rules perspective. Because I think as it raises the question, this occurs before the round, if a player, gets rendered knocked unconscious a few months before his tee time and isn't able to start, is the committee justified in waiving the penalty? I think the answer would be yes. That
well, I was surprised at that, but you got 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think.
What year was it?
88. Yeah, I think I would have given him more than 5 minutes to recover.
One other one,
Concussion
USGA Junior Championship.
quarterfinal match, Rob Steffen was one of our players in the event. He's playing against Willie Wood, and he's on the tee to have a 8 o'clock tee time. And Rob's up there ready to go, and there's no Willie Wood. Oh. And all of a sudden, like that, the starter comes out and said, well, you know, I mean, we give 5 minutes, like that. Rob, you're the one by, you know, default, the player's not here. What do I do? Another next match is 5 hours later or something like that. And so all of a sudden, at 11 o'clock, here comes Willie Wood. And he comes in, he said, well, I'm ready to play. And Frank Hannigan is sitting like that, and they're saying, well, you were supposed to tee off at 8 o'clock. Well, Frank, I called in for my starting. I talked to you and asked you when I played. And there was another Wood in the field, Otto Wood or something like that, or W Wood. There was a Willie Wood and William Wood. It was unbelievable. And apparently when he called, Frank told him, he says, 11 o'clock.
Right. I had heard that story. I think that happened maybe in Delaware. But the version I had heard was that it was match play and that the opponent was told incorrectly, well, you know, you go ahead and tee off, and however many holes you play before he shows up is how many holes you've won. So, you know, he just takes off down the first hole, sprinting, and then maybe there's a different incident.
Shot, and then he played the first hole, and still no Willie Wood. He walked off, and he hung around, and he didn't know what to do. And then he was hanging around 3 hours later, or 2.5 hours, or something like that. Out comes Willie, and Frank comes out, and he says, oh, there he is on the putting green. Walked over and said, we made an error, and the match has to be played. And so he went out, and they went like 20 holes, and Willie Wood won.
Yeah. And that's the type of thing that, you know, again, it's an administrator's headache, but, you know, that was the right ruling for when the committee gives a player the incorrect tee time and the player's late as a result to do that. But I'm sure Bill's thinking, geez, what if this happened several hours later? What if the opponent had gone? And, for example, what if they were just scheduled to play one match that day and the opponent was back at the hotel an hour away? And the headaches involved with that.
We talked about that point. Had it been the second match, you know, and after he left and he's gone, you know, it goes to the movies, and then here comes Willie like that, and what would you do then? I mean,
it's tough. I mean, as a committee, you just try to do the best you can in all circumstances.
I was having a beer with Frank like that, and Hannigan, he was saying, am I sure glad he hung around? You know, it sort of made my decision later easier because I found him and told them like that, and they went out and played.
Well, or worst case, right? I hate to even mention this. I don't want to talk about. Anyway, I won't talk about what the committee should do. But let's say, you know, Willie shows up well later, and the first player had already teed off in his next round match. Mm-hmm. You know, the variations are just mind-boggling.
Another starting situation, Tim Dean will occur. This was a junior championship at Holy Meadows. He was in the final group with other players. And it was supposed to be, and there was Phil Plouch Jr., and they were tied, you know, going at a stroke play. And Phil Plouch. All of a sudden, telephone call coming, and this is the state patrol calling here in Fond du Lac because we have just picked up this young boy who's have a stolen car. And it was Phil, and he said, I'm not stolen. It's my father works for an automobile agency, and he has a loaner. And he didn't have a ride. He says, young Phil, take the car and go up there. Meantime, the people at the auto agency said, there's a stolen car. I mean, you know, it's not around like that.
Sounds worse than it is.
Now, we're sitting here, Tim and I are, you know, what do we do? You know, you're talking about going out to help somebody, and here's a situation where the young guy got picked up, and we're talking to the state cop. And we made a decision.
You made a decision.
Yeah, to rest a while, and all of a sudden, here comes the squad car into the parking lot, and out he comes, no shoes on, carrying his bag, and it was about 20 minutes later or something like that, and we allowed him to play. I mean,
boy, that's a new one. So a player.
Is that an Evergreen? No.
Rolling Meadows.
Rolling Meadows.
Okay, so a player is wrongfully arrested for stealing a car. And maybe I'm getting so soft, but yeah, I would have done the same thing. I
We
think.
had one at Evergreen similar.
And those were, one, he didn't do anything wrong, and two, all of that was entirely beyond his control, and three, it's safe to say that is exceptional. And he was, wrongly arrested.
Another one at Evergreen, where the state trooper lived on a golf course. So when he picked up the kid,
I was committee man.
he brought him again to the golf course, and he just made his tee time.
That was 1990.
Yeah.
That was the match.
Remember that?
Let's not go there.
Really, what happened to the kid that got cold cocked on the fourth hole?
Well, we waited a little more than 10 or 15 minutes, but I wound up taking the kid back out behind the last group and let him finish. He had started on 10, so it was his last,
You owe me a
5.5 holes.
I may have misunderstood. The penalty for disqualification is after 5 minutes.
Right.
So why would an alternate be put into play prior to 5 minutes?
Well, part of it is sometimes some committees will say, for example, that sometimes you know that the player's not going to be there.
Well, okay, I understand that, and that's okay, yeah.
And why some committees will do that?
Under those circumstances, I have no problem.
Maybe you're doing it just in case he truly is disqualified, or that maybe they're doing it just for the sake of. Because if you wait 5 minutes, it can't be an awkward situation because the two fellow competitors are down the fairway, hopefully, down near their ball, waiting for this guy to play, and then he has to run down there. So it's not a smooth way to start the
Another question you may want to wait to Rule 33 to discuss, but this committee, the players must start on time. Is there any rule that a starter can start a group ahead of time?
Oh, okay. Well, what's nice with that says that players must start at the time established by the committee, and in effect, what that time becomes is when the starter tells them to start. Because if a starter tells them to start early, then basically that's essentially the same as getting a ruling that might be an incorrect ruling, although sometimes it can be a justified ruling. And that what if, for example, two players in the group in front have withdrawn, and if the other two players in the subsequent group were okay with moving up?
In the event that this were to happen in a tournament, an alternate put in, whether it be before the 5 minutes or after 5 minutes, would a better phrase be like conditionally or whatever? And I say that only because, like with the USGA checkpoint policy, any penalty less than disqualification cannot be modified, rescinded, or imposed. So I think the phrasing is potential, conditional, something to that effect.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to tell the alternate, saying, look, so-and-so is not here. We assume he's not going to show up, but there's always the potential he could show up with an all-world excuse, in which case he would be reinstated and you would be removed. But I think it's worthwhile to mention that possibility.
Could you say something like, unless he is has an exceptional circumstance which warrant waiving the penalty?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile saying you're in unless so-and-so has truly exceptional circumstances.
Well, the alternate also will say, I want to get 5 minutes.
You run into that same issue if you've got an opening in one group and two groups later somebody else doesn't show and you put an alternate in and then ultimately take him out, who would have been in. Does the second alternate then come out?
Oh, you're right. So you've got alternate number one is in, but then that player shows, alternate one's in, tees off. Alternate number two groups later, tees off. Then player number one shows up, great excuse, so alternate one comes out. So what do you do with alternate number two? And yeah, I think that's certainly possible. And I think what you would do is I think alternate 1 should still take precedent over alternate number 2, so I think alternate 2 would be removed in that case. Alternate 1 would keep playing, and, you might rearrange the groups or something to accommodate that. But,
well, would there be any reason that these alternates, if it fit within the size of the groups, continue to play this condition that possibly they might be used later?
I think it's possible, but in general, I think it's helpful not to have players playing the course that are at that moment not in the field. Just but things can come up. Occasionally things will come up where, let's say, especially it's a tournament or qualifier at a good course, maybe a private course that they can't otherwise play, and a player's done something, and you have to go out on number 12 and talk to him, and he's disqualified. And let's say he's playing a group of 3, so there are markers for the remaining players. That it's a good idea to just get him off the golf course. What if he'll say, but I really want to play the last 6 holes at Milwaukee Country Club or wherever the tournament is, because just strange things can happen when you have non-competitor players, not in a competition, playing on the course in terms of advice, influencing balls, and other things. So,
Dash 4?
All right. Well, actually, first 6-3B. In stroke play, competitor must remain throughout the round, the group arranged by the committee, unless the committee authorizes or ratifies a change. So authorizes means that on the spot the committee might might actually direct the players to split up. Let's say if you're playing groups of 2 and one player withdraws during this round, the committee might tell the one player he was with to play with the group of 2 behind him for the rest of the round to make sure he would have a marker. And ratifies means after the fact the committee could give its blessing. So if that happens and the committee hadn't been involved and the players on their own just a single drop back and played with the following 2 ball, the committee could say, yeah, that's okay. But otherwise, players can't just say, I don't like playing with you, I'm going to go play with someone else.
In the case of Rory Sabatini and Ben Crane, where they were in a 2-sub and essentially the guy went up ahead more than a shot, does that constitute not remaining?
Yeah, I know you have the case, and among other things, I've learned that in stroke play or in high school golf, some, like I remember, I think Arrowhead really encourages it. That they have some slogan, I forget, to say that when you play in groups of 3 or more, the first player to hole out should just immediately go to the next tee, and the second player takes care of the flagstick and this and that. And so the question is, are they satisfying the requirements of this? I think yes, that especially in that case, that even though it's rude in some cases not to do that, like with the playoff case, I remember especially it was rude, but it wasn't a breach of this rule. Often for there to be a breach, you have to leave your group, you actually have to be in another group.
AJGA teaches that.
Okay. So the AJGA says, okay, first one in, you go ahead and go to one to the bag, 2 to the flag. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, 1 to the bag, 2 to the flag.
Second guy takes the flag.
Okay, okay. All right.
John, there was a situation where a young player, there was a confrontation between 2 players, and even a threat to the junior championship. And so, like, I'm not going to play with it anymore. This guy knows what's going to happen. So he goes and plays by himself, or moves away. I assume that comes under where a committee would ratify a situation that occurred?
A committee could, and that, for example, if 2 players have an altercation and one player is literally fearing for his life, and he joins up with the group behind, I think in some cases, the committee could say, see, circumstances, that is reasonable. So the bottom line is the committee ultimately has the final say as to whether that was okay to do.
And you have an example you want to talk about?
Indian Cherokee?
No name.
Yeah, this is a state junior.
1996, let's move on.
Man, a lot happened at the WSGA events. All right, Rule 6-4, caddy. Player is allowed to be assisted by a caddy, which includes giving advice, but he's limited to one caddy at a time. And in some cases, a player may well have more than one caddy during the round. For example, if his caddy might sprain his ankle on the 6th hole, and he might have a different caddy for the 12 holes. That's certainly okay, but he's only allowed one caddy at a time. So penalty for breach of this rule, we're really talking about just for having more than one caddy at a given time. And then match play, and again, this will be an adjustment to the state of the match. At the conclusion of the hole where the breach is discovered, deduct a hole for each hole which a breach occurred, maximum deduction of 2 holes. Stroke play, 2 strokes for each hole where a breach occurred, maximum penalty per round of 4 strokes. Match play or stroke play, if the breach is discovered between holes, it's deemed to have been discovered during play of the next hole, and the penalty is applied accordingly. All right, now, just as we saw with clubs, a player having more than one caddy in breach of this rule must immediately, upon discovery that a breach has occurred, ensure he has no more than one caddy at any one time for the rest of that round. Otherwise, he is disqualified.
What does any one time mean?
Can
that be every shot?
Well, just at any one moment. So even if it's, say, just walking along, let's say, from, the tee to the fairway, Gene, if you give someone else one or more of your clubs to carry, while your caddy carries the other 12 or 13, then at that one time, you have 2 caddies as soon as you do that.
But not equipment, right, John? In other words, I got a caddy and he's got the clubs and it's getting kind of inclement and I don't want to be bothering the caddy in and out of the bag, so I hand the rain jacket or rain suit to my wife who's walking along. She wouldn't be considered a caddy there, would you?
No, that's right. That's an important point. But now you raised it, Tim, is that with the definition of caddy and what's considered to be caddy, the emphasis is really placed on handling not just equipment, but specifically clubs. That it sounds strange that, for example, if Bill is your caddy, you could actually hire me, pay me to walk along holding an umbrella over your head, and I wouldn't be considered a second caddy. So.
Not a chance.
And note that in the conditions of competition, the committee may prohibit the use of caddies. For example, in NCAA golf, they just do not allow caddies at all. I believe is HHGA the same way? Do they not allow caddies? Or the committee may restrict a player in his choice of a caddy. So, for example, at the U.S. Junior Championships, a parent may not serve as a caddy, or if a committee wanted to say that only an amateur could serve as a caddy, the committee could do so. All right, 6-5, ball just states that the responsibility for playing the proper ball rests with the player. The players are encouraged to put an identification mark on their balls. So, and this is important because to say the final responsibility rests with the player. So if a player hits his ball into the rough and a caddy up there points to the ball and says, "That's your ball," the player says, "Okay, great, thanks," plays it, well, too bad. And it turns out not to be his ball. He's played a wrong ball. That even though a caddy told him that was his ball, ultimately he's responsible for playing the correct ball. All right, 6-6, scoring and stroke play. And the first point is appreciating that this rule is unique to stroke play. That in match play, there is no requirement to keep a scorecard. Often players will keep a scorecard in match play, but just know that scorecard in match play carries no official significance. So it's just there as a informal, helpful way for the players to keep track of the state of the match. 6-6A, after each hole, the marker should check the score with the competitor and record it. On completing the round, the marker must sign the scorecard, hand it to the competitor. If more than one marker records the scores, each must sign for the part for which he's responsible. So at that last point, let's say Ken, Bill, and I are playing together, and I'm Bill's marker, but I withdraw after 9 holes. Then I would sign the scorecard for the first 9 before I head in. Then Ken would be his marker for the back 9 and would sign the scorecard for 10 through 18. It's not a requirement for the marker to check the score with the player after each hole. So for example, you don't have to say, Tiger, I just want to make sure it was at 11 or was that 12 you made there? Probably not a good thing to ask on the way to the next tee. 6-6B, signing and returning the scorecard. On completion of the round, the competitor should check a score for each hole and settle any doubtful points with the committee. So again, very, very good idea to settle those doubtful points before you return your scorecard, because after you return your scorecard, your score can't be altered. And if there was a problem, then there could be a disqualification penalty. And that's why it's so helpful to have a good, or at least a good rules official in the scoring tent, so the players have someone there that can answer any rules questions they might have. So the player must ensure that the marker has signed the scorecard himself, and return it to the committee as soon as possible. So the requirements, so there are a lot of requirements there. That the player ultimately is responsible for making sure his marker signed the scorecard. He must sign the sign the scorecard, and return it to the committee as soon as possible. So if one of those 2 signatures is missing, or if he doesn't return it to the committee as soon as possible, as we see, the penalty for breach of this rule is disqualification. 6-6B or 6-6C, alteration of scorecard, just states that no alteration may be made after it has been returned. And then there's a useful decision, 6-6C/1, which elaborates on what is meant by returning the scorecard. And as that decision states, it's really up to each committee to develop its own policy as to when it considers the scorecard to be returned. And a common position the committees will take is that a scorecard has been returned when the player has left the scoring area. So the benefit of that is that means, say, if Arnold's in the scoring area and I'm the player and I slide my scorecard across the table to him, and he looks at it and says, well, wait a minute, John, did you really shoot 41 on the 9th hole? When obviously that was my 9-hole total. Then I can say, oh no, that was my 9-hole total. I made a 5 on 9. Then we can correct that because I haven't yet left the scoring area. So that's the benefit of that. But certainly there can be forms of play where that's just not practicable. Where, let's say, for example, you have a shotgun start where you don't necessarily have the luxury of having every player sit down with a rules official before you return the scorecard. And you might say, okay, as soon as you put your scorecard in the box on the table in front of the main scoreboard, at that moment that scorecard is returned and no alterations may be made. So it doesn't give the players quite the luxury as the other situation. It does have the benefit of being very clear with the black and white nature of it, that once it's in the box, that's it. It may not be altered.
I was wondering if you could comment on the last 4 words of Rule 6-6B.
Okay.
And I've noticed that that's not defined in a very similar fashion that as near as possible is not defined under the rules. And what would you consider not as soon as possible?
Well, I mean, as soon as possible. I mean, somewhat fortunately, I've heard of, off the top of my head, I can only think of one specific ruling I've heard of where it was debatable. But most of them, it's black and white cases where player gets back to the hotel room and he's getting ready to take a shower and he finds a scorecard in his pocket. Obviously there it's not going to be as soon as possible. And I forget what incident it was. I think it was a college event at Oak Tree years and years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And I forget what the details were. But that was the only incident I've heard of where, you actually had to stop and think, where it wasn't immediately clear. And what does as soon as possible mean? That certainly it's, that phrase is broad enough to allow to weigh all circumstances. There are cases, especially at, say, the major championships where you want to have a quiet place for the players to return the scorecard, but also a secure place, physically secure place where players might have to walk hundreds of yards from the 18th green back into the back into the clubhouse or scoring trailer or somewhere. So they could, in some cases, it might take 5 or more minutes just to get to the scoring area. And that's certainly as soon as possible.
Can a committee define that?
Can a committee define that? I think I'd be hesitant to put a specific time and say, okay, at this golf course, it means you've got to be in the scoring area within 3 minutes or whatever. Because I think you want to allow certain circumstances. For example, I often think about this, say at televised professional events, 72nd green, when the player wins and his wife and children run out onto the green, he's given the trophy and this and that. Okay, what's as soon as possible? And then give them circumstances. Okay, all that's reasonable. But
I bring it up, like the 18th green at Erin Hills is a considerable distance from either clubhouse, and what if you also brought in a player leaves the 18th green, goes to the parking lot to put his clubs away, and comes back, perhaps after the group behind him has returned their cards.
And often, for example, I think you do have to have some flexibility because there could be, for example, there are times where a player just has to use the restroom right away. But often a barometer is if the 2 fellow competitors are in there and have been in the scoring area for a while, the player is going to need a pretty good reason for being late. And if he says, oh, gee, or especially if they return their scorecard left, if he says, oh, gee, I was just calling my mom because I was so happy with how I played today, that's not a good reason. So it allows just judgment on the circumstances. As I said, fortunately, the situations tend to be black and white. That it's. Have you ever had any that were kind of in a gray area?
No, the classic example: a guy calls up, he goes, just like you said, hey, I got back to the hotel. Well, enjoy your hot fudge sundae at Dairy Queen. On the other hand, you'll get a case where, and you brought it up, 2 guys will finish. You're waiting for the 3rd guy, wondering where he is, and so is one of the other 2, by the way. And the guy will say, like, oh, I had to go to the bathroom, or oh, I went to the car to return my clubs. And on this level, it may be a little different than coming back to a scoring area. It could be a shotgun start. And that's why I was just wondering why it's not.
I think, especially on your example of a shotgun start, it's a great one where, it could be 15 minutes. Imagine, shotgun start at Erin Hills and you finish on 15.
Could be 30 minutes.
We have a lot of problems with that, and half the time it's because the marker, they can't find the marker, things like that. It happens, and we just use judgment.
Yeah, I think that's right. That you just listen to what the players say as to why he's been late, and you will determine if that's reasonable.
And we've tried not to use like a drop box for the finality of that. That's a way, but.
What would you do, John, if a guy that's got your scorecard disappears and your scorecard's gone?
Okay, well, and that happens. That you're playing with somebody, he just makes a 9 on 18, he knows he's missed a cut, and he's had it, he's out of there.
Decision 6-6B/6.
Yeah, that's covered.
6-6B/6. And that says, in effect, the committee should do whatever it can to reach that missing marker, retrieve the scorecard, but if it can't, then obviously you can't penalize the player for it, so they let him recreate the scorecard, and hopefully there was another player in the group who could attest to the scores and retrospectively effectively become his marker.
Jim, I'm impressed.
I just read it.
No, I bet Tim puts in his time. He prepares for these things. That's good. All right, 6-6D, wrong score for hole. The competitor is responsible for the correctness of the score recorded for each hole on a scorecard. If he returns a score for any hole lower than actually taken, he is disqualified. If he returns a score for any hole higher than actually taken, the score is returned stands. So, again, the committee is responsible for the addition. The competitor just needs to make sure he gets the hole-by-hole scores correct. So if a player makes a 4 on a hole, but he returns a 3, whether it's because there was a penalty he didn't include or just poor math, he would be disqualified. But if it's the other way around, if he made a 3, but he returned a 4, which is what happened with Roberto Di Vincenzo in the 68 Masters, the 4, the higher score, would stand for the player. Undue delay and slow play. Most tournaments have a specific pace of play policy that goes into great detail as to when players are subject to penalties under that. But even if there is a pace of play policy in effect, this rule can still apply, that there are certain circumstances where a player could unduly delay play, be subject to penalty under this rule, even though he hasn't really fallen outside the parameters of the pace of play policy. For example, if his group might be, if he returns to a par 5 tee to retrieve a club he left there or something like that, that even though his group might still be within the pace of play policy, he's considered to be unduly delaying play. And one point to be aware of with this and the next rule is that there is a distinction with very different penalties between undue delay and discontinuance of play. That undue delay means you're still playing, you're just all of a sudden you've done something, you're taking too long to play, and the penalty is a lesser penalty, whereas next rule, 6-8, an unauthorized discontinuance of play means you really stop playing and are subject to disqualification. And there are a few decisions that hint at some of the differences as to what is undue delay, what's discontinuance of play, but there's not really a bright, clear line as to where that as to what that is. So, for example, if you stop and turn to watch the final round of the U.S. Open for 10 minutes, that's undue delay. If you do that for 45 minutes, that's discontinuance of play. So somewhere in between those two is a line. Where that line is, I don't know, but it's just helpful to know that there is a difference between those two. Note 2 here goes on to allow a committee to change the penalty structure so that a player might not be penalized until actually his second, if he's being timed, his second bad time. In some cases, or to change it so that the first bad time is for a one-stroke penalty and stroke play, which is a common penalty structure for many committees. All right, 6-8 then is discontinuing play. First section A deals with when a player is allowed to discontinue play, and that is first when the committee suspended play. Could be because the course is unplayable because of rain, because of wind, could be because of dangerous situation, thunderstorm, or could be because of darkness at the end of the day. The player on his own may discontinue play if he thinks there is danger from lightning, that since it is his life that is at stake, he's allowed to make that decision on his own. 3, if the player seeking a decision from the committee on a doubtful or disputed point. But remember, as we saw last week on Rule 2-5, in match play, if players can't come to an agreement, they need to keep playing. And if one player disagrees with the resolution, he may make a claim about that. Or 4, player may discontinue play if there's some other good reason, such as the one Bill mentioned about the player who was struck in the head with a ball. Bad weather is not of itself a good reason for discontinuing play. So if in these latter 3 cases, if a player discontinues play without specific permission from the committee, he must report as soon as practicable. If he does so and the committee considers the reason satisfactory, saying, I was all the way out there and I saw lightning, so I stopped playing and took shelter, they would say, okay, no problem, no penalty for discontinuing play. Otherwise, meaning that 1, the player does not report to the committee as soon as practicable, or 2, the committee, he does so and the committee does not consider the reason satisfactory, he is disqualified. An exception to this is in match play, where 2 players can discontinue play. For example, if it's raining really hard and they want to stop for 30 minutes, see if the rain lets up, it's okay for them to do that unless they delay the overall competition. 6-8B, which deals specifically with the first item, when the committee has suspended play. If the players are between the play of 2 holes, then they're done playing. They're not allowed to play anymore. But if at least 1 player in the group has started play of a hole, then they can play some or all of that hole. But then they may not play beyond that hole. And then the final paragraph, the players must resume play when the committee has ordered a resumption of play. So what does that mean? That if when the committee blows the air horn to resume play, the player is supposed to be on the 3rd tee with his group, and they're able to play at that time. If he is not there, then he is disqualified. So penalties for breach of this rule mainly comes up when players do not resume play at the correct time.
And there's no 5 minutes involved there either.
Well, and what's interesting is this penalty statement does not give 5 minutes, but there is a decision, though, that does give the players and the committee some leeway. 6-B/6 that does, in effect, give the player a 5-minute leeway, just saying that given the confusing nature of a resumption of play with a lot of players over a big area, that it's reasonable to cut the player a little bit of slack, so he's still going to be penalized, being disqualified to give him 2 penalty strokes. And in some cases, there's no penalty at all. Like all too often, say, okay, we're going to resume play at 8 o'clock in the morning. Players are out at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they hear what they think is the air horn signaling resumption of play, but it turned out to be a truck or something else. And because of that, they resumed play at 7:59 before the rules air horn went off. Then the committee could say, fine, no penalty, is reasonable for you to do what you did.
Well, the resumption of play commences after the sound of a horn, and the player plays before the horn sounds. Isn't that a breach?
It is, but what I was saying is where the players hear something that sounds like the horn. It could be from a truck or a horn nearby or something, that they mistook for the air horn. And that happens a lot more often than you might think. And there's so many. It could be, for example, the local town's weekly testing of their siren or something.
It's sometimes interesting to watch that rule play out as darkness approaches with players and the games between one guy putting out, one guy running to the next tee.
And it is interesting how this is one rule players seem to know. They seem to know that as long as one of them, and where this really matters is when they're trying to finish the round, that if they're close, if they're on 17, they know that at least one of them tees off on 18 before the horn blows, that they can all finish 18. And one point to keep in mind with committees, with suspension of play, it can be helpful, is despite the desire of the players on the last hole to finish and not have to come back early the next morning. From your perspective and from the perspective of other players on the course, it can be helpful to err a little bit on the early side of blowing the horn to suspend play, because if you do so, you increase the chances of having all the players finish the hole they're on, which means, one, the maintenance staff the next morning aren't going to have to worry about ball markers being out on the course and so forth. And also, it just greatly simplifies the resumption the next morning, that you don't hear calls on the radio, oh, player so-and-so can't find his ball marker, what should he do? And this, player A was in a bunker, the bunker was raked, what do we do? That if everybody's just starting on a tee, then it's essentially a shotgun start. It's just a smoother start to the day. All right, a note that is frequently adopted: the committee may provide the conditions that in potentially dangerous situations, such as thunderstorms, play must be discontinued immediately. If a player doesn't do so, he is disqualified. So this is something that certainly the WSGA and almost all committees use. And there's one and only one reason for that, is for safety reasons, both for the players, for the volunteers, for the spectators. They want everybody to get to a safe place before the lightning actually arrives. But that is an optional condition of competition that the committee must say is in effect. So if the committee blows the horn for a dangerous situation, and most committees will use a single note of the air horn for that, then the players aren't allowed to play anymore, not even one more stroke. Rule 6-8C, lifting ball when play is discontinued. So if the player discontinues play under this rule, he may lift the ball only if the committee suspended play or there is a good reason to lift it. And decision 6-8C/1 discusses what is meant by a good reason to lift it. And it says that usually that would involve the player having to leave the area, perhaps to go find a rules official or for other reasons, and that the player's concerned the ball might be moved while he is away. Otherwise, the ball needs to stay on the ground, so stay where it is. And the reason for that is to prevent abuse, where a player could say, okay, I want a ruling, and, oh, by the way, I'm going to lift and clean my ball while I'm waiting for the ruling. So to prevent that. And if the player lifts the ball without good reason, if he doesn't mark the position, or if he does not report the lifting of the ball, he incurs one penalty stroke. All right, 6-8D, an important rule that one to know well, because this comes up a lot, usually at tournaments at all levels, from national down to high school tournaments. You hear a lot of chatter on the radio whenever there's the resumption of play as to exactly what's allowed and not allowed. First, with the premise that play must be resumed from where it was discontinued. So the player must, either before or when play is resumed, proceed as follows. If the player had lifted the ball before play or when play was suspended, he must, provide he was allowed to lift it, for example, during a suspension of play, place the original ball or substituted ball in the spot from which the original is lifted. So that does allow a player to substitute balls, and that partly that's just for practical reasons, that often suspensions are overnight, and it's probably asking a lot for players to keep track of that exact ball overnight. So the player may place the original or substitute ball down, or if he had not lifted his ball, let's say, for example, he'd hit his tee shot and then play is suspended for a dangerous situation, and the player wisely immediately heads into the clubhouse and just leaves his ball out there in the fairway. He may, provided he was entitled to lift it, lift clean and replace the ball, or substitute another ball. So in other words, what that means is the case where, let's say, Bill and I hit our tee shots on par 4 and then play is suspended, let's say especially if it's a dangerous situation. If Bill goes up to the fairway, marks marks the position of and lifts his ball, and I immediately go to the clubhouse, which is kind of what you want players to do in a dangerous situation, that we're both treated the same. We both have the same rights when play is resumed to have a clean or different ball down. Now, third point, if the ball or ball marker is moved, even by wind or water, while play is discontinued, a ball or ball marker must be placed on the spot from which the original ball or ball marker was moved. Now, often, as we'll see in Rule 18, if wind or water moves your ball during play, you have to accept it. Play the ball from wherever the wind or water takes it. But this is different, and this third point ties in to the opening part of this rule, that play must be resumed from where it was discontinued. So if your ball was at point A when play was discontinued, and then, say, a gully of casual water came through and moved your ball 20 yards, well, you still go back to point A, to where the ball was when play was discontinued. And this is an important note because it's really an exception to Rule 20-3C, that if a player goes out to resume play, but he can't determine where the ball was. Let's say he left the ball there, the ball had just been moved, or it could have been gobbled up by a mower or taken by a spectator or something like that. If his ball or ball marker has been moved and he can't tell where it was, he will estimate that spot and place, underline the word placed in your book, and you'll place it on the estimated spot. Because as we'll see on Rule 20-3C, normally if that's the case through the green or in a hazard, what does the player do? Estimate where the ball was and drop the ball there. So this is different, and this procedure really is there to ensure that the player has a similar lie to what he had when play was suspended. And this works both ways. That imagine, for example, a player's ball was on the edge of the fairway when play suspended. He goes there and puts a dime and a couple of tees down to mark the position of the ball, comes back to resume play, and those objects are no longer there. So he doesn't know where the ball was. Before this note was introduced in Rule 20-3C, what would he do? He would drop the ball, he'd drop it, and then it rolls into thick U.S. Open rough from where he has to just tack out onto the fairway. And that's pretty harsh, especially, say, for a dangerous situation where the player had no choice to play the ball. And the player did what he reasonably could to protect the location of the ball by putting several objects down to mark its location. So this ensures that he can still place the ball in the fairway, because when he returns now, he knows his ball is in the fairway. Likewise, if for the player's ball was in the rough, he's going to have to place it in the rough. He can't get lucky and drop the ball and have it roll into the fairway.
If my ball were hit into a lateral water hazard or water hazard, and the flow of water was moving the ball somewhere, likely, let's say, out of bounds, and play was suspended, and the ball was in bounds.
The ball was in motion.
During the suspension, it was carried by the stream out of bounds. My question is, it's a far-fetched example, but was, the statement, play shall be continued from the spot where it was discontinued. And when the siren blew at that time, the ball was in motion. However, if a ball was in motion from a stroke in the air, and the siren blew while the ball was in the air, if that ball went out of bounds, you'd be out of bounds.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the starting point. First, let's look at just the ball not in the water hazard. So I hit a tee shot while my ball's in motion, the siren blows. Then the ball goes into a bunker, let's say, make it even more straightforward. And I think everyone would say, okay, ball's in the bunker. So if that's the case, then I think you have to wait for the ball to come to rest to determine where it lay when it was suspended. So in your case, ball's in water, in a water hazard, in bounds, horn blows, then the water in the water hazard continues to carry it out of bounds and stays out of bounds, then it is out of bounds. All right, now let's look at a few, yeah.
The purpose of the last sentence in small I.
In small I, otherwise the original ball must be replaced?
Yeah,
That's a case where the player was not entitled to lift his ball when he discontinued play. So let's say that a player discontinues play to get a decision from the committee, and he lifts his ball, in the committee's eyes, he didn't have a good reason to lift it. Then what that means is when he then resumes play, he has to put that same ball back down.
John, let me just say it again, one more time. Okay, your ball, his example, you hit it into the water hazard, all right, and, okay, now, play is suspended, and that water hazard has moving water, takes out a bond. Why would you do it the way you said it, rather than here's where my ball last crossed the hazard, and that it's the appropriate drop? Why would you not do that rather than have to take the out of bounds?
Well, that does seem like a tough situation because, there are courses, especially, say, I've heard of courses in the Rockies that have, these roaring rivers, and there's nothing you can do. There's a decision in the book that talks about the situation that says, well, the committee can just put a grate across the stream to catch balls from going out of bounds. Well, okay, but if it's a raging river that's 100 yards wide, that really doesn't work. And why is it that way? Why can't we just say, well, the ball is in bounds or is in the water hazard? Because at the end of the day, the ball lies out of bounds. It's a little bit like, let's say you have a ball that lands on a road, part of the road's in bounds and continues to roll down the road, and then the road becomes out of bounds and winds up part of the road that's out of bounds. We'd all say, well, too bad you're out of bounds, because ultimately that's where the ball does lie. It's an unfortunate situation, and no one likes it, especially those courses type of thing. I suppose that if they really, really want to, they could go to some links to, maybe in some cases they could, to mark things so that the out of bounds does include the river. The out of bounds is just on either side of the river, and the river remains on the course as a water hazard. All right, let's look at a few decisions under Rule 6 here. See, we've covered 6-2/1. 6-2B/0.5 raised a good question, and fortunately Jeff is on top of that. 6-2B/3.5 we referred to as well, that even though if the committee puts the handicap on the scorecard, the player needs to make sure it's correct. All right, let's look at a couple of decisions under 6-3A. 6-3A/2, time of starting, all competitors must be present. So A, B, and C are playing together. They have a 9 o'clock tee time. A and B are there at 9 o'clock. And C arrives at 9:02, exactly when the starter is calling C to play as the third player in that group. Has C fulfilled the requirement of this rule? And the answer to this is no. And it's an important decision because it establishes the principle that all players in the group need to be there at the time of starting. So C would wind up in stroke play with a 2-stroke penalty on that first hole. Then the next decision, 6-3A/2.5, is useful because it clarifies exactly what, say, a 9 o'clock starting time means. That if a player arrives at 9 o'clock and 45 seconds, is he on time? In other words, is he on time as long as he gets there before 9:01? And the answer is no. He has to be there when the clock changes from 8:59:59 to 9:00:00. If he's not there at that moment, he is disqualified.
With regard to decision 6-3A/3, in that specific case, the two players could go play the first hole, correct?
Yeah, in fact, and that's a pretty realistic question that there really the RNA and USGA have never published an answer as whether it's one or two players. But let's say, for example, Bill, you and I have 9 o'clock tee time. You're there, but I show up at 9:02. Okay, I lose the first hole. So what's the common question? Well, can you and I still play the first hole? I think the answer is, usually yes, you can, although people feel slightly uneasy. But, usually people say yes, you can. So now in this case, if we're both played, can we play the first hole? And odds are, I'd say first and foremost, odds are the committee's not going to want you to do so because you probably delay.
Right.
So I think the best thing is just to say no. You
send them to the second.
In many cases, just for the piece of play reason, I don't think you can really penalize them for doing it. And not certainly as a committee, no matter what you do, they're not going to be what you tell them to say. They can be penalized. All right, one decision, we kind of touched on this example earlier, 6-4/4. Caddy hires boy to carry all of players' clubs except putter. So the caddy carries the player's putter and helps the player with club selection and reading greens and so forth, while someone else carries 13 of the player's clubs that doesn't do anything else. Is the player considered to have two caddies? And the answer is yes, he is considered to have two caddies. So that just gives an idea as to how strictly that rule can be interpreted. But on the other hand, keep in mind the following decision, 6-4/4.5, that really covers just a one-time incident where, let's see, the caddy has to return to the tee to retrieve the player's glove and gives the clubs to someone else to carry. Is the player considered to have two caddies? The answer is no. The casual act of assisting the player or his caddy in these circumstances is not a breach of the rule. So there can be a distinction between the two. But in general, it's even just one extra person carrying just one club is often would be considered a second caddy. All right, decision 6-6A/2, competitor plays several holes without marker. Well, I think that's unlikely or extremely unlikely to happen. I think most players know they need to have a marker. It's I think a useful decision because I like the last clause of the answer that he did not have an acceptable score. That's a good way to look at all marker situations. Say, did the player ultimately have an acceptable score? Meaning, was it attested by someone?
Why does it not go on to say that he's disqualified?
Oh, that's a good point. That's one thing that can be annoying with some decisions is the question, the actual question is not the one that we would often like to think. That it would be more helpful, be more black and white of should A be disqualified? Answer yes. Then go on. That the implication is, you're right, that they should be disqualified by not accepting the scorecard, but it could be more explicitly stated. I agree. And for example, sometimes there'll be decisions where, well, was this appropriate? Well, what does appropriate mean? We want to know, was it in accordance with the rules? 6-6A/5 is something that comes up who knows how many times each year in high school golf, and is testament or an example of the saying that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. That often players, especially juniors, will know that if you return an incorrect score for a lower score, that you're disqualified. Say, okay, so then they're out there, they're serving as someone's marker. Say Tim is serving as my marker. He sees me breach a rule. He knows there's a 2-stroke penalty, but he doesn't include it on my scorecard. And I don't include it either, so I made a 6 on a hole, or I that I return a 4 when in fact it should have been a 6 with a 2-stroke penalty. We both signed the scorecard, returned to the committee, but then as soon as we leave the scoring area, Tim races back to the scoreboard, tell the committee, no, John scores wrong back there on 13. He grounded his club in the bunker, so he should be disqualified. Okay, true. No getting around the fact that I should be disqualified. But what this decision says is that Tim should also be disqualified because he knowingly attested an incorrect score. 6-6A/5. So this could be for sneaky reasons in Tim's case that he was trying to get me disqualified. Or it could be for nice reasons because I had a terrible day and Tim didn't want to rub salt in the wounds and didn't want to raise that issue. But either way, as all competitors are basically counting on Tim to make sure that my score is correct, and if he knowingly does not do that, then he should be disqualified.
In a team competition which allows a coach or coaches to give advice, I now have seen this decision circumvented where the coach or assistant coach withholds the information.
Okay.
And I was wondering if this decision doesn't state it, and there really is no recourse, it's still the player is disqualified.
Yeah, so you're saying, what if you're the coach from an opposing team, you breach your rule, you don't say anything, you wait for me to return my card, as I do it, you go to the committee and say...
Or the player tells the coach. The marker, knows that something happened, tells the coach, and the coach brings it up. I mean, that's a simple thing. How did the coach know? Well, the player told him. But sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle.
And I think in that case, where the marker tells the coach that shows that the marker knew that the score was incorrect. And if the marker still signed the scorecard and then this comes up after the card is returned, I think the marker would still be disqualified. But let's say if the marker was oblivious to this, but if just the coach on its own noticed this, then the marker would be penalized. And obviously, hopefully the coach will do the right thing and tell the player and the marker before the scorecard's returned. But if he doesn't, then...
And that's strictly because the coach or assistant, if two are allowed, are not part of the player's side.
Exactly. That even though the coach, by condition of competition, is allowed to give advice, he's still an outside agency. Let's see what else there is. 6-6C/1, when scorecard considered returned. We talked about that. And the important thing is just for committees to have thought about this beforehand and to have their own policy laid out. Decision 6-6D, we're not going to go over there. With 6-8, suspension and resumption of play. Well, actually, here's a useful one for committees to know with 6-8B/9. Resumption of play when players must be present. Well, let's say, for example, you have a suspension of play for darkness at the end of the day, and you have several groups on a hole, and they all finish playing that hole. So as a result, you have 3 groups now on that next tee for the resumption of play the next morning. So if all players show up and I'm in the 3rd group, I know it's going to be at least 10 or 15 minutes till I can tee off. So the question is, do I need to, if resumption's at 8 o'clock, do I need to be there at 8 o'clock, even though I know I'll likely have a wait, or do I just need to be there when my group can play? And the answer is the group must be present and ready to play when it becomes possible for the group to play. And that, and if a player doesn't show up until, say, 8:05 or 8:10, he does so with some risk. Because sometimes, for example, what if the players in the preceding groups decide not to show up that day because they're all out of the tournament and they want to get back to work? They want to miss any more time from work or school, and all of a sudden that third group turns out to be the first group to play, then you need to be there at 8 o'clock. But if all players are there and your group can't tee off until 8:11, then you need to be there at 8:11. All right, two decisions that are useful to committees, 6-8D/1 and 6-8D/2, talking about the resumption of play and what a player is entitled to when play is resumed. So the first decision asks the question, does this requirement to resume play from where is discontinued mean the player is always entitled to the lie he had prior to discontinuance? The answer is no. The original lie or the conditions around that lie may be altered through natural causes, wind, rain, and the player must accept those conditions, whether they worsen or improve the lie of the ball, and so forth. That you could have a case where you had a nice lie in a bunker, and now you have a terrible lie because there's a little gully going through there that was formed from the rain, and the bunker's not been prepared by the maintenance staff.
What's this decision number?
6-8D, as in David, /1 and /2. Oh.
Thank you.
And then the next decision is a useful one because it comes up a lot, much more than we'd like, and there's nobody likes a suspension of play. But what do you do with bunkers? A player's ball who is in a bunker, he has to go out and resume play. And as you can tell, the answer depends as to whether the bunker's been prepared by the maintenance staff. If it has, so if the maintenance staff has raked the bunker as they normally do most mornings, then what does that mean? That means that the player's original lie has been altered. Or under Rule 20-3B, he will recreate that original lie and place a ball in that lie. However, if the bunker has not been prepared by the greenkeeping staff, so let's say, for example, you have a suspension of play in the afternoon for a couple of hours and you resume play at 6 p.m., maintenance staff, in most cases, is going to be long gone by then, and you just have what you have out there. So if that's the case, the player is not necessarily entitled to lie he had prior to the discontinuance. The player must place the ball in the spot from which the original was lifted, and as we saw with that first decision, 6-8D/1, it could be a better spot, could be a worse spot, but good or bad, that's where the player must place a ball.
I thought 6-8D/3 was it?
Okay, 6-8D/3. Okay, let's look at that. Player's ball lies on an immovable obstruction, play suspended. After the committee orders a resumption of play, and before the player makes a stroke, he takes relief from the obstruction. Prior to playing the drop ball, may he lift it under Rule 6-8D and either clean and replace the ball or substitute another ball. And the answer to that is yes. And the rationale behind it is a little bit of a stretch, but in effect what they're trying to do is to ensure the same treatment, that the player effectively has the same rights as he would have if, say, he had lifted and dropped the ball when play was suspended before.
Could the player have taken relief during the suspension?
Could he have during the suspension? The answer to that is yes, because there's a decision that says what suspending play means is making no more strokes. So even if play is suspended for a dangerous situation, the player's ball is on a cart path and then he drops the ball off the path, he is not in breach of that condition. That discontinuing play means making no more strokes. All right, so that is Rule 6. Any more questions about that? If not, we'll have a 15-minute break. We'll resume at 10:10. Oh, 11:10. Yeah, sorry. Is that right? Wow.
That's what? Having fun?
Yeah. Yeah, Rule 6 is a long rule.
And I know driving from just north
I
of
wanna
Atlanta.
clarify this 90%, 95%.
Day before, when I got
Do you use that?
12 hours.
You do, why?
In that part, not a team.
Oh, okay, not in stroke play like.
All right, on to Rule 7. We have a number of shorter rules ahead of us, so we'll go through a couple of these, and then we'll call it a day around noon. All right, Rule 7 deals with practice, and this rule is broken down between practice before between rounds and then practice during the round. Practice before or between rounds is split up into the two forms of play with very different results. In match play, a player may practice on the competition course before a round. In stroke play, he may not. And the reason for that is really just opportunity. So let's say if Andy and I are playing a match at 8 o'clock, then in theory, we both have equal opportunity to go out and practice on the course before our match. On the other hand, if Andy and I are playing in a stroke play event, and say I have a 7:30 tee time and Andy has a 2 o'clock tee time, then Andy has a greater opportunity to practice on the competition course, which doesn't quite seem right just because we happen to have different tee times. So that is why that is not allowed in stroke play. And also in stroke play, it goes on to say that when 2 or more rounds are to be played over consecutive days, a competitor must not practice between those rounds on a course remaining to be played or test surface of any putting green by rolling a ball or roughening or scraping the surface. And the penalty for breach of this in stroke play is disqualification. So something that happens, unfortunately, all too often is, let's say you have a member guest tournament and a guest from out of town comes in and stay with his friend who's a member who also happens to live on the 18th tee. And what do? To get to the course in the morning, they just tee it up on 18, play the 18th hole on the way to the clubhouse. Then they practice and tee off in their round. Well, they have practiced on the competition course before their round by playing the 18th hole and are disqualified. But the note allows the committee basically to reverse everything we just talked about, to prohibit practicing on the course before match play and to allow it in stroke play. Then match play, for example, the committee might decide that it would be a mess, it would really disrupt the maintenance staff to allow players to play on the course beforehand. In stroke play, for example, let's say you have a 36-hole tournament over the weekend at a course that everyone has played probably hundreds of times, figuring, what's the harm in letting them play between those rounds, especially if, say, Saturday afternoon, if one of the players wants to go out and play 9 holes with his or her son or daughter, what's the harm in that? Apart from the practical perspective that if you're a member of a private club, it can be dangerous to tell a member that he can't play his golf course. So that is before or between rounds. During the round, first point is a player must not make a practice stroke during the play of a hole, with absolutely no exceptions to that. So during play of a hole, no practice at all. Between the play of 2 holes, some practice is limited or is allowed, but with a number of restrictions. First, it's limited only to putting or chipping, so no full shots or anything like that. And that putting or chipping must be on or near the putting green of the hole last played, the practice putting green, or the next teeing ground. And the stroke may not be made from a hazard, must not unduly delay play. So to try to capture all of those in one example, player tees off number 1, plays the front 9. There's a little bit of a delay on the 10th tee, so he wants to practice his putting. Where is he allowed to practice his putting before he tees off number 10? Ninth green, the practice putting green is nearby, and the 10th teeing ground itself. And when we talk about the 10th teeing ground, that is to be taken literally. Remember the definitions from last week with teeing ground is if you're playing from the blue tees, then your teeing ground is the 2 club length rectangular area defined by those blue tee markers. There was a case at the Women's Open in 2001 or 2000 or so down the road at the Merit Club, where the players were playing from the second tee from the back, and the back tee was a separate tee about 30 or 40 yards behind. There was a delay. One player, while waiting, dropped a few balls on that back teeing area and practiced her putting. So the question was she on or near her teeing ground? 30 yards away, you have to say no, she was not. So she unfortunately was penalized 2 strokes for that.
Well, when you say 30 yards away, so in other words, if you were delayed and you're on your tee in the area and you don't stay between the 2 club lengths and the width of the thing, that's not a...
Yeah, you don't have to practice within the actual teeing ground. That's where it says on or near. So if you're near, that allows some leeway. And I think everyone would say 30 yards is not near. Strokes made in continuing the play of a hole, the result of which has been decided, are not practice strokes. And again, that's one of those statements in the rules that, without the benefit of an example, is a little bit of a head scratcher. So let's go over an example or two with that and why that is a significant statement. So let's say in match play, if Ken and I are playing a match against each other, and on the 3rd hole, we hit our par 4, we hit our tee shots in the fairway. I'm away, as always, and I hit the ball up into a greenside bunker, and then Ken holds the 2nd shot. So the result of that hole is to decide Ken wins the hole. So, but now my ball lies in a bunker. I go up and I play that bunker shot. If that's considered a practice stroke, then what? I'm going to be penalized. I'm going to lose the next hole because I practiced from a hazard, something what we just read prohibits me from doing. But this sentence that we just read about strokes made continuing the play of a hole, the result of which has been decided are not practice strokes, provides that bunker shot I'm playing is not a practice stroke and therefore is okay for me to make. The same principle would apply in, for example, Stableford competitions, where in Stableford, if you're playing against the score of par, if you make a double bogey or worse on the hole, you don't earn any points. So the result has been decided. So let's say on a par 4, I lie 6 and I'm still 100 yards away, but I want to go ahead and finish the hole. This says that I can finish the hole without that being considered practice strokes.
That defeats the purpose of...
It defeats part of the purpose of Stableford. You're right. But so be it. Exception: when play has been suspended by the committee, before resuming play, a player may practice as provided in this rule anywhere other than on the competition course and as otherwise permitted by the committee. So let's go through those 3 spots as provided in this rule. So let's say the night before, play was suspended for darkness, and Bill, Ken, and I, we finished the hole we were playing. We finished number 7. So we're starting from the 8th tee. And let's say in the resumption's at 8 o'clock in the morning, and at 7:45 we're out there. Where may we practice before 8 o'clock?
And we're on the 9th tee.
We're on the 8th tee.
7th green.
Well, it's actually not limited to, well, some is limited to 8 o'clock. So think about this. So walking through all this, we as provided in this rule, so that would mean, for example, the 7th green. We go to the 7th green and practice putting or chipping on or near it. We could go to the 8th teeing ground and practice putting, chipping on or near it. Anywhere other than on the competition course. So, for example, assuming there's a designated practice area, 8 o'clock, we could practice there, and is otherwise permitted by the committee. And, for example, I've been at one WSGA championship where the practice area was actually several miles from the golf course, and there was a suspension of play. Then a few hours later, play resumed, and because of the huge amount of time that had been lost in terms to transport players to the practice area, get them back, didn't let them go there. So instead, what did is went out and said, okay, before you resume play, you can hit 3 balls into the woods to loosen up. So if you're in the 7th fairway, you can go back out to the 7th fairway and fire up to 3 balls into the trees, and that's not considered to be a breach of this rule because the committee said that. So that's an example of that. Penalty for breach of this rule is loss of hole or 2 strokes, and in the event of a breach between holes, the penalty applies to the next hole. So, for example, if I finish the 6th hole and then I practice some bunker shots on number 6, the penalty applies to the 7th hole. Now, notes practice swing is not a practice stroke. And what's the difference between a practice swing and a practice stroke is that a stroke involves a ball, whereas a practice swing does not. So practice swing can be taken anywhere as long as you don't breach the rules. So, for example, in a bunker, you don't touch the sand. Note 2, the committee may prohibit practice on or near the putting green of the hole last played and rolling a ball on the putting green of the hole last played. So the PGA Tour does this in part for pace of play, in part for appearance sake, and also some committees will mark the next day's hole location with a dot of paint. So by prohibiting rolling the ball means players aren't able to go ahead and get an early read on how the next day's hole location will play. Let's see, now the decisions. 7-1B/5, competitors caddy practices on or tests putting green surfaces before the stroke play round. That is not a breach because, remember, under Rule 6-1, a player is responsible for his caddy's actions only during the stipulated round. And as we've talked about, that's a practical and necessary position because, well, one, you don't necessarily want to know what your caddy's been doing since midnight. And secondly, you don't want to have to interview the caddy. For example, if you have a 2 o'clock tee time, do you want to say, okay, what have you been doing since midnight? Have you been out on the course? If so, what have you done? And so forth. So the line has to be drawn somewhere. Decision 7-2/1.7, explanation of strokes made in continuing the play of a hole, goes on with the point we just made. Sometimes in match play, say, go back to Ken and me again, where on the 6th hole I hit 2 tee shots out of bounds and I immediately concede the hole to Ken. Would it be okay for me to go ahead, go up to the fairway, drop a ball approximately where one of my tee shots went out of bounds and continue on? The answer to that is yes, that strokes made in continuing play of a hole does not mean they have to be played in accordance with the rules of golf. So something like that would be okay, would not be considered a practice stroke. And then the last decision, 7-2/12, is a good one for committees to know. The committee suspends play and the resumption is at 8 o'clock the next day. A player whose group is going to be a third to play wants to practice on the designated practice area after play has been resumed at 8 o'clock, because he knows that, let's say, he'll be in the third group to play from that tee. What's the ruling? All right, well, once play is resumed at 8 o'clock, the exception to Rule 7-2 no longer applies, so therefore only Rule 7-2 governs where he may practice, which would mean, for example, on or near the last putting green or the next tee. So he may not, after 8 o'clock, continue to hit drivers at the practice tee. All right, any questions on Rule 7?
I've asked this question before.
So did you not like to answer?
No, but I want to make sure that I interpret it right. Because it's happened to me. Delay of play. That's a subjective decision. Next hole's a par 3. There's nobody on the green. There's also nobody behind the group.
Okay.
Player decides to take a practice putt. Now, the next hole's open, so therefore, if he takes a practice, but he's delaying play, is there any wiggle room there?
There is, and it comes in the form of an adjective, because the key is that he's not prohibited from delaying play. What's prohibited is undue delay, so he can't unduly delay play, which I think involves an amount of time. So I think staying, for example, trying the 5-foot putt, you missed that again. That's not undue delay. I think it would mean spending.
But then doing it again?
Well, you're right. At some point, there's a line where you cross between, okay, that's okay, but then all of a sudden this is undue delay. At some point, there is a line. I'm not going to tell you what it is.
With regard to practice and unduly delaying play, would that constitute just holding up the group behind you, essentially?
Well, I think there can be a couple of types of undue delay. One, you're delaying your own group from playing, and two, you could be delaying another group from playing. So I think it could factor in either or both.
It seems to me that the best answer to a situation like that is a warning.
I think from a practical level, yes, but let's say, for example, from a distance you see this happen, and a player takes 5 minutes, spends 5 minutes putting or chipping when the next tee is clear, or let's say his whole group does. I think everyone would be comfortable saying that is undue delay. But sometimes, let's say they spend maybe 30 seconds or a minute, then you warn them and say, guys, that's a close call. It's probably not quite undue delay, but you need to be aware of that there's the potential for penalty for that.
Thank you.
All right, anything else on Rule 7?
John, on that 7-2/12, the shotgun,
Oh, okay.
and say you're the second group on the first, okay, can you still practice? At 8:05, you're not getting the other.
Well, it depends as to where you practice. That you're after 8 o'clock, you can't, for example, practice on the practice area anymore. That you're limited to the so it's the shotgun start. You're saying the very start of the round. So then there is no previous putting green. So no, I'm sorry. Shotgun start of the round. So you're right. So we're not even. This is not a 7-2 question. It's really just a 7-1B question. So then before your tee time, which often in shotgun starts, you say it's when the fairway clears, when your group can play. So let's say if it's an 8 o'clock shotgun start, it's 8:06 or 8:07 or whenever. You could in that case at the start of the round continue to practice at the practice area. Okay.
Chipping green the same as a putting green?
Is the chipping green the same as the putting green? Let's see. What I think so. What does the rule say? Any practice putting green. So I think as long as that chipping green is maintained the same way, say mown at essentially the same height, that would be okay. All right, on to Rule 8. 8-1, advice. We went over this definition last week, and we said this is an example of a straightforward rule, but the real hang-ups, the real questions really revolve around the definition of what is advice. So the rule itself, during the stipulated round, the player must not give advice to anyone in the competition playing on the course other than his partner, or ask for advice from anyone other than his partner or either of their caddies. So two elements, giving and asking. So giving advice, unsolicited or not, may not be done to anyone on the competition playing on the course. So that's interesting. Let's say on the first hole I tee off, I slice my tee shot down near the practice tee, and Bill's there warming up before his round. And while I'm searching for my ball, I stop and give and make a comment about Bill's alignment. Is that a breach of this rule? Answer is no. Even though Bill's in the competition, he's not yet playing on the course, so no breach. But once, let's say I'm looking for my ball in the trees between 5 and 7, and Bill's coming down 7, and I see Bill hit a shot, and I say, Bill, you're lined up way right on that. then I've given advice. And what's the rule in that case when Bill never asked me for advice and I just give it to him? No penalty for Bill, right, in stroke play, and but I incur the 2-stroke penalty. And I'm prohibited from asking for advice from anyone other than my partner or caddy. So it's a fellow competitor, could be a spectator, for example. I'm not allowed to, if I find a spectator's been at 12th green all day, to ask, which way this putt's going to break and so forth. I can't do that. And we'll go through some decisions with that. So the rule itself is straightforward. The tricky part is determining whether a question or statement really constitutes advice. 8-2A, indicating the line of play. This is broken up onto other than on the putting green and on the putting green. So except on the putting green, anyone may indicate the line of play, but no one may be positioned on or close to the line or beyond while the stroke is being made. And any mark by the player with his knowledge for that purpose must be removed before the stroke. So for example, a common application is, say I've got a blind shot from around the green, let's say at Lawsonia, and I can't see the flag stick, and I ask Bill if he'd walk over and show me where the flag stick is. He does so, and then and he moves to the side. That is fine. On the putting green, it's different. When the ball's on the putting green, the player, his partner, or either of their caddies may before but not during the stroke point out a line for putting, but in so doing, the putting green must not be touched, and a mark must not be placed anywhere on or off the putting green to indicate a line for putting. So one thing to keep in mind here is who is allowed to indicate a line for putting. Well, it's exactly the same people who may give you advice, which means, in effect, that the rules are treating indicating a line for putting the same as giving advice, which makes sense. And the putting green must not be touched for that purpose, for indicating the line for putting, and a mark must not be placed anywhere. Penalty for breach of this rule, whether it's 8-1 or 8-2, is loss of hole or 2 strokes. A note, as we see in high school and college competitions and international team competitions, the committee may, if it wishes, allow each team to appoint one person to give advice. So let's look at a few decisions about this. 8-1/2 goes back to the definition of advice, clarifying that distance information is not advice and therefore may freely be exchanged for any purpose. So that could be, for example, if I'm playing with Bill has a rangefinder and I don't, and local rules in effect allowing the use of rangefinders, it's okay if I ask Bill, how far he is, or how far I am. That's okay. Decision 8-1/6 is kind of an interesting one. Let's say you have 2 parallel par 3s that are essentially the same length, 4 and 6. When we get to number 6, I ask Bill what club he'd hit on number 4 for the specific purpose of helping me determine what club I'm going to hit on number 6. Am I considered to have asked for advice? The answer to that is no. So that's the extreme case, and what that says is really once you've played a hole, that club information used on that hole, no matter the circumstances, is not advice.
John, is there such a thing as adverse advice? Situation back in '60, I was down in Texas with a guy named Bobby Unger, who was a good player, and he said we got a game on the public course down there with 2 Mexican players. He said pretty good. One's a pro, or they're both pro. And one of them was Ollie Trompas, and the other guy's named Lee Trevino. I'd never heard of him. And he got to a hole, it was 175 yards over water, into the wind. And he hits his shot and puts it about 6-7 feet, really good shot. And he turns around and he gives a little Mexican dance, and he says, boy, that 7-iron really went up there, like that. That's really good. Well, Unger takes a 6-iron out and knocks it right in the water. And I look in Trevino's bag, he's got 3 7-irons. So he had them all shaped, and so he was trying to tell the 7-iron, and really it was a 5-iron probably, or something like that, and, well, anything?
Yeah, there is. Actually, if you look at decision 8-1/9, it sounds like your case. A made a statement regarding his club selection, which was purposely misleading and was obviously intended to be overheard by B, who had a similar shot. What's the ruling? It says A was in breach of Rule 8-1. And it's a little bit of a stretch to call that advice, but that's what the decision does say.
Bad advice.
Well, and one thing to keep in mind with the advice rule, the quality of the advice does not affect the penalty. That one question, especially for those of you who I know a number of you still like to play competitively. Decision 8-1/16, suggesting the competitor that he deem his ball unplayable. If a player goes up and says, "Look, you've got no shot at all. If I were you, I would deem it unplayable." Is he giving advice? And the answer to that's yes, because he's suggesting a specific course of action. And that can be dangerous. Now, are there ways almost to reach that result without breaching the advice rule? Answer could be yes. What if Bill is playing with somebody and Bill says, you know your options under the unplayable ball rule? The player says, "Oh, unplayable ball rule, that's an idea." That's it's largely, unfortunately, with a lot of advice questions, it comes down to semantics. But
what about a rules official? He walks up and he sees the situation. Is it ethical or right for the rules official to ask the player if he knows his options before the player asks him what his options are?
I think it can be a close call, but certainly as an official, you're there to answer his questions, provide information, and not really to try to steer him down a certain path. Although, frankly, there are some events where you just want players to finish a hole, and you almost do whatever you can to let them do that. I think in that case, as often as not, you try not to say that. There could be some cases where you might just, rather than saying, "Do you know your options under the unplayable ball rule?" maybe you just say, "Do you want to know your options?"
Well, that's what I meant. It's okay to say to a player, "Do you want to know what your options are under the unplayable ball?"
Well, I think in a case like that, it might be a little less leading just to say, "Do you want to know what your options are?"
Okay.
Rather
Yeah. Same with holes, water hazard options, things like that. A question.
It happens all the time, and
it could be, with a ball on the cart path even. Do you want to know what your options are?
There's a question online that says, is there a time when you would consider suggesting someone hit a provisional ball be considered advice?
Okay, and that's a good and common question. Is there a time you consider the suggestion to play a provisional ball advice? And the answer to that really is no, because there's really only one thing to be gained by playing a provisional ball, and that is saving time. That the original is in fact lost. The player is going to come back to that spot and play. So you're not. So all you're doing is the suggestion is really just to save time, and it's not affecting where he's going to play from. It's just affecting almost when he would play from.
Well, that's another thing that we do a lot. Is tell a player tell a player that he may play a provisional ball.
Yeah, I think that's fine. For example, Ken, if you have me over to Hidden Glen, which I've never played before, I hit a wild shot, and I don't know what's over there. You say, "John, there's some really tall rough. You might want to play a provisional ball." No problem at all.
Yeah, you're right. Should is better.
All right. Decision 8-1/20, asking advice when play suspended. that is okay, because how does Rule 8-1 start? During the stipulated round. So you're not actually during the stipulated round, so that's why you're allowed to do lots of things during the suspension. Get advice, use the practice area, and so forth. 8-1/22, teammates playing as fellow competitors exchange advice. And I mention this just since I know a lot here officiate high school and college events, that at a normal team event where, say, 5 or 6 players play, you count the low 4 scores in stroke play, it is important to remember, and for the players to remember, that they're still fellow competitors and are not partners and may not exchange advice. Decision 8-1/25 is a good one to walk through because it goes through the mechanics of who is penalized and what circumstances for breach of the advice rule. And a lot of it depends as to the form of play. That if Bill and I are playing a match, and I say, Bill, we're on par 3 tee, he has the honor, and I say, Bill, what club did you just hit? And he says 6-iron. That I lose the hole as soon as I ask for advice, so it doesn't matter that he answered the question. On the other hand, if we're playing individual stroke play, we're both going to get a 2-stroke penalty because we both did something wrong. I asked for advice, Bill gave advice. And you feel a little bad for Bill because he was just being nice and answering the question that I asked. But the bottom line is that he did do something the rules don't allow him to do.
You gave last year a scenario where the first hole is a par 3.
Okay.
And while it being far-fetched, it's not that far-fetched where one guy gives advice, one guy...
Yeah, let's take an example where the first hole is a par 3, and it's far-fetched, but as you all know, sometimes I think far-fetched questions can be good in that they force us to read the rule very closely and learn something about the rule that maybe we didn't know before. Let's say the first hole is a par 3. Bill and I are playing together individual stroke play, let's say. And Bill has the honor. Bill plays, hits it up onto the green. And I say, Bill, what club did you hit? And Bill says, I hit 6-iron. I say, great, thank you. What's the ruling?
Well, once you said thank you, there's no problem.
Politely ask for advice. All right, so what's the ruling in that case? Well, read the rule. Read the rule. Because you want to think about it. In this case, I had not yet started the round, so is there any breach for me asking for advice? No. And Bill did give advice, but did he give advice to someone playing on the course? Not yet. So neither one of us is penalized in that case. That sounds pretty strange, but so be it.
Can you imagine that going on the audio of a national championship if that was the first hole?
Well, you're right. Somebody
calling in right now.
Well, that would be like the British Open occasionally is at Royal Open St. Anne's, which has a par 3 first hole. And imagine, not that, frankly, players are that willing to help each other, but imagine if that happened, you're right, the whole phone system might shut the hell up. And sometimes that's almost the type of thing you'd want to suggest to players, saying, look, if you want to have fun with, these people who call in, if you want to get back at them, here's a way to do it. All right, and here's another one that's it's a good one that not necessarily because it happens a lot, but it's a good practice one for various rules exams. 8-2B/3. The caddy of a player is preparing to play a chip shot from off the putting green, touches the green with the club to indicate the line of play. What is the ruling? And I say this because it takes a situation to which you know what the answer is. That is, if this happened on the putting green, you know it would be a penalty, and it changes one fact. It moves where the ball is. So essentially it asks you the question of, does it matter where the ball lies? And the answer in this case is yes, it does. it does matter, because if this happens with a stroke from off the putting green, there's no penalty for touching the putting green. So, all right, any questions on Rule 8?
If a player's ball lay on the putting green and the line of putt would extend out into the fringe, the player's caddy can touch the fringe under Rule 8-2. But is there any prohibition about touching the line of putt, which now extends off of the green?
Okay, all right, good question. Let's say a player has a widely breaking putt, and he has to hit it up through the fringe of the green. And his caddy goes up there to indicate the apex, and he touches the fringe of the green. Is there a penalty? And let's look at it, because there are two different rules involved. Let's first look at Rule 8-2B. It talks about, by so doing, the putting green must not be touched. All right, so therefore there's no breach of Rule 8-2B with that. Then the question is there a breach of Rule 16-1A? Because remember last week with definition of line of putt, that if the line of putt goes off the putting green, that part of the line that's off the green is still part of the line of putt, and therefore under Rule 16-1A must not be touched. So if the area the caddy touched on the fringe was actually on the line of putt, then that's a breach. But if the part he touched on the fringe was not on the line of putt, he was just giving him an aiming point, say kind of beyond the apex, then there'd be no breach. Okay, anything else on Rule 8? If not, go on to Rule 9. Maybe we'll see, this might be our last rule. Rule 9, information is the strokes given. 9-1 starts with the statement that number of strokes the players taken includes penalty strokes incurred. And then, as you'll see, it's really a match play driven rule. First, 9-2A asserts that an opponent is entitled to ascertain from the player a number of strokes he's taken during play of the hole, and after play of the hole, number of strokes he has taken. And the reason for that is the opponent needs to know how the match stands, so he can adjust his strategy accordingly. 9-2B talks about wrong information, and it starts in the main part of the rule just provides that if you give wrong information, you lose the hole. Then the next 3 sections plus paragraph really clarify what wrong information is. Sometimes it's intuitive, sometimes it's not intuitive. And so this is a good rule to know well, and especially to be aware of its close relationship with Rule 2-5, because remember from last week that a player may make a late claim after someone is teed off on the next hole if he was not aware of the facts and if his opponent had given him wrong information. So it's important to know what wrong information is. And so here in 9-2B we say a player is deemed to have given wrong information if he, 1, fails to inform the opponent as soon as practicable that he's incurred a penalty unless A, he was obviously proceeding under a rule involving a penalty, and this was observed by the opponent. So, for example, if I hit my ball into a lateral water hazard, Bill sees me do that, sees me drop within 2 club lengths of where the ball last crossed the hazard margin. I don't have to turn to Bill and say, Bill, I'm taking a penalty stroke here for relief from the hazard. I don't have to do that. And the other exception is if I correct the mistake before the opponent makes his next stroke, then I have not given wrong information. And with that, and let's look on the opposite page of the decisions book to 9-2/1 as to what is meant by as soon as practicable. The rule requires a player who's incurred a penalty to tell his opponent about that penalty as soon as practicable. And that phrase is purposely broad to allow for consideration of the circumstances, especially the proximity of the player to his opponent. Thus, informing the opponent as soon as practicable of a penalty incurred does not, in all circumstances, mean that he must do so before the opponent makes his next stroke. So an example of that, let's say Tim and I are having a match. Tim's in the left trees, I'm in the right trees. I address my ball. As I start my backswing, the ball moves. I continue my stroke and strike the ball. So first question is, what's the ruling? There's one penalty stroke for the ball moving after address. So I've incurred one penalty stroke, and I need to tell Tim of that penalty stroke as soon as practicable. But Tim is now 60 yards away in trees on the other side of the fairway, and he plays just 10 seconds after I play. And then he plays, and then we meet in the fairway, and then I say, Tim, just so you know, I incurred a penalty back there for the ball moving after I addressed it. Have I fulfilled my responsibility under this rule? Answer to that's yes. Because even though I told him after his next stroke, I still told him as soon as really the circumstances would allow me to tell him. So I'm okay with that. I've not given wrong information if I correct the mistake before the opponent makes his next stroke. So let's say we're standing in the fairway. Tim asks me what I lie, and I say I lie 3. Tim says, okay, well, in that case, I'm going to lay up. And he gets his 6-iron out of his bag. And then before he plays, I say, oh, no, I'm sorry, I really lie 3, or some other number. Then as long as I correct that incorrect information before he plays, it's not wrong information. And that's one way, a helpful way to look at these situations is be aware of the different uses of wrong information and incorrect information, because wrong information is always going to be a penalty, and incorrect information still has a time window within which to correct that mistake. So it's helpful to some to look at those two different terms: incorrect information that becomes wrong information, which then means a penalty. Secondly, a player is deemed to have given wrong information if he gives incorrect information during play of a hole and does not correct the mistake before the opponent makes his next stroke. We just went over that example. 3, if he gives incorrect information regarding the number of strokes taken to complete a hole, and this affects the opponent's understanding of the result of the hole, unless he corrects the mistake before any player makes a stroke from the next teeing ground, or in the case of the last hole, before all players leave the putting. And this is another one, especially with this business about affecting the opponent's understanding of the result, where it's especially helpful to go over an example or two. So let's say Tim and I have a match. On the 4th hole, Tim scores 4. We walk off the green, and Tim says, John, what'd you make? And I said, I had 4 too. And he says, okay, so we have the hole. And then we tee off on the next hole, walking down the next hole, and I say, whoops, Tim, sorry, it turns out I really scored 5 back there. Well, that really wouldn't matter. But let's say that is the case. Then have I given Tim wrong information? And did that affect his understanding of the hole? Answer is yes, because he teed off that next hole thinking we'd have the hole, when in fact he had won the hole. Or it could be he had thought I told him I made 3. I thought that I'd won the hole. But there could be a case where we're walking off the hole, and Tim says, John, I scored 6. What do you make? And I said, I make 4. He says, okay, so I lost the hole. We tee off on the next hole, and I said, oh, Tim, just so you know, I was wrong. I actually scored 5 back there, which is what I did score. So is there any penalty then? In that case, no, because whether I scored 4 or 5, Tim's understanding was that he lost the hole. Either way, that's the result. So in that case, no penalty. Now, this final paragraph of 9-2B is especially important as it relates to Rule 2-5. A player has given wrong information even if it is due to the failure to include a penalty that he did not know he had incurred. It's the player's responsibility to know the rules. So this is how it can apply and be used in concert with Rule 2-5. Example, we went over last week some with agreement to waive the rules and so forth. Let's in making claims. Back to the pine cone example. Bill and I are playing a match. Third hole, Bill's in the left greenside bunker. I'm in the right greenside bunker. Bill can't see what I'm doing, and I remove a pine cone from that bunker before I play. Hit the ball up. We hole out. We think we both scored 5 on the hole and half the hole. And then 2 holes later, I tell Bill about the pine cone in the bunker, saying, it's strange. I wonder how in the world a pine cone came to be on this golf course. And Bill learns that I had removed it. So at that point, may he make a late claim? The answer is yes, because he was not aware of the facts, the fact that I had removed that pine cone. And secondly, I had given him wrong information. I had incurred a penalty by removing that pine cone, and by not telling Bill of that penalty, even though I didn't know there was a penalty, I am deemed to have given wrong information. So since both those criteria are met, Bill can now make a late claim about that third hole. So that's why that final paragraph is very important. Then 9-3, and stroke play, just a suggestion, not a requirement, to let your marker know when you've incurred a penalty. Because let's say something happens on the first hole and you've incurred a penalty, whether that's still going to be fresh in your mind 4 hours later, maybe not. So it's just a suggestion to help ensure that you ultimately return the correct score at the end of the round. All right, so a few decisions. 9/1, incorrect information on the rules. That if, let's say, Bill and I don't know anything about the rules, I hit my ball onto a cart path, and Bill and I think that it makes sense that I can drop 2 club lengths to the side of the path, which involves my dropping and playing from a wrong place, that we know that in stroke play, I'm going to be penalized for playing from a wrong place. Well, or let's say it happens in match play. First, we know from other decisions last week that the result of that is going to stand, and there's no agreement to waive rules because we didn't know the rules, and there's no penalty on Bill for giving me incorrect information on the rules. The one time there could be a penalty on Bill would be if he knowingly gave me incorrect information on the rules, in which case the committee might disqualify him under Rule 33-7. So if he knew full well what I was supposed to do, but he, for good or bad reasons, told me that the rules allow me to do something else, then he could be disqualified. In these decisions, while there really aren't many or any that stand out, it is useful because the whole concept, the concepts of wrong information and making claims are fairly involved. It is useful and worthwhile to spend time just going through the decisions under Rule 2-5 and under Rule 9-2, just to help train your mind to think in the same way that those decisions are written and the way they approach those situations. And that really is one of the benefits of the decisions book, is almost through osmosis, and we're not aware of it, that it hopefully trains us to think of situations and approach them in a certain way, to look at the facts, look at the part of the course, at who's involved, identifying what the key issues are, and then resolving that.
9-2 and 2-5 are taught concurrently at rule school, are they not?
I think they are now. They are, for that very reason. And 9-3/1 mentioned in part just with all of the especially conducting USGA qualifiers and qualifiers for our own championships here. We see an awful lot of stroke play, hole-by-hole playoffs. And this decision just reinforces the notion that the stroke play playoff is still stroke play, even though it does now provide a little bit of quite a bit of a different answer, but it's just for these very limited circumstances. And I think especially, for those of you who've been around the rules and decisions for many years, just be aware that this is one that was revised. It must have been in 2012.
When was that changed?
The very last one, 9-3/1, the incorrect information, stroke play playoff. So, all right, any questions on Rule 9? Well, if not, it's right at 12 o'clock. So what we'll do, we'll call it quits for this week there. And next week, we'll resume with Rule 10, and hopefully we'll get through, probably at least 14, hopefully 15. One thing I would encourage you all to do before next week, spend some time with both Rule 13 and its decisions, because it's a very, very intense rule. With officiating, it comes up with an awful lot of situations, and as you could tell, there are more decisions under Rule 13 than any other rule in the book. So it's a good one to know quite well. And as for the schedule for next week, on probably Monday, Bill and David will send out an email reminder with the link to sign up, whether it's for online or to come here in person, as well as with the schedule of the remaining sessions. But remember that next week's is going to be on Thursday, Thursday the 22nd, and it'll be 8 to 12. And likewise on Monday, when Bill and David send out that email, it should include a link to the audio part of today's session, if there's anything especially exciting that you want to review. But otherwise, thank you all very much, and I hope everyone has a good weekend.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. For next year.